Good afternoon and welcome. I am State Senator Jason Lewis, and I serve as the Senate Chair of the Joint Committee on Education. To my left is our Policy Counsel, Lizzie Noonan. I want to thank Lizzie for all her work in organizing today's special briefing for the Education Committee. I also want to thank Rob Saylor and Paul Albright from my staff as well for their work in also making pulling together today's briefing and handling all of the logistics. Some of the committee members and some of the experts who will be speaking are obviously with us in person. We greatly appreciate your participation, and some are participating remotely, and we obviously appreciate very much their participation as well. I want to introduce the members of the Education Committee that are with us. Senator Pat Jalen just joined us. Senator Jalen, please come join me up here if you're comfortable. So Senator Jalen is with us. We also have she's either with us or will be momentarily Senator Robin Kennedy. Also from the House side of the committee, Representative Richard Klopp is with us remotely, and I also am anticipating Representative John Marks to be joining us as well. And there may be some other members of the committee who will also participate in this briefing. I will in a moment just share a few opening remarks on the topic area, which, as we all know, deals with how we assess and hold accountable our public K-12 schools and districts here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. After the opening remarks, we're going to have just an overview of kind of how the current assessment and accountability system works, just to kind of level set for all of us. And then the main part of the briefing today will really be a discussion of where the current system we have needs improvement and falls short of the goal of having a goal we all share, which is high performing, high quality public schools that all our students can attend. We will be discussing innovative and potentially more effective approaches taking place in Massachusetts and other parts of the country that we can draw upon. And I hope to also have recommendations for further action coming out of this briefing. Again, I want to thank everybody. In a moment, I'll introduce you all. And the way this is structured is not a traditional, each expert is going to kind of speak for 10 minutes and then move on to the next. It's going to be more of an interactive dialogue where we tackle this in a few different topic areas where any of our experts, should feel free to chime in, and members of the Education Committee should feel free to, ask questions, share ideas yourselves, and, try to really have this be an interactive, robust today. That's certainly my hope. We set aside until 4 p.m. I don't know if we'll need all that time or if we'll run a little over, but, roughly we've hopefully given ourselves plenty of time to really, explore in some depth this very important topic. All right, so let me dive into my opening remarks then. Again, I want to thank everyone for joining, for being part of this Joint Committee on Education briefing, where we will be exploring innovative and more effective approaches to K-12 public school and district assessment and accountability. We're delighted to be joined by a terrific group of experts and stakeholders who will be sharing their insights and findings with us, and I look forward to using this briefing to engage in a robust dialogue on this very important topic. Few institutions are more important to our society than our public schools, and we ask our schools to provide a tremendous amount for our students and their families. First and foremost, of course, is for them to provide students with a high-quality education with a strong academic foundation. But of course, we ask a lot more from them than just excellence in academics. Schools are expected to deliver a wide variety of skills, competencies, supports, and services for students, and in many cases, their families as well. Just a few examples would be food security and nutrition, mental health services and counseling, proficiency in critical thinking and problem solving, in collaboration, teamwork, preparing our students for civic life and for taking part in our democracy. And of course, readiness for life after secondary school, either at college, career, or the military. No two schools or districts look exactly the same. They serve different student populations in different communities with often widely varying resource levels. Schools and districts that serve largely lower income communities and students of color face far greater challenges as compared to schools and districts that primarily serve more affluent white communities. Rural schools and districts also face unique challenges. I think we all agree that we want all of our public schools to be as high performing and as effective as possible in achieving positive outcomes for every one of their students. This means that it is critical that we are able to assess school and district performance in an authentic, robust, and holistic way that best captures the complexity and the unique challenges facing different schools and districts. For too long, here in Massachusetts, and really across most of the country, we have defaulted to systems of assessment that rely solely, or in large part, on simply what is easiest to measure. And that, of course, is standardized tests that students take in multiple grade levels. While standardized tests do provide some useful data, and I believe should play some role in school and district assessment, they should only be one part of a holistic assessment and accountability system. The good news is that we have pockets of innovation and promising new approaches to assessing school and district performance, including right here in Massachusetts with the Massachusetts Consortium for Innovative Education Assessment. I look forward to learning more about these new and potentially more effective approaches in the course of the briefing this afternoon. As we are all well aware, we are having a conversation right now in Massachusetts about what will replace the 10th grade MCAS as a statewide high school graduation requirement. The topic for this briefing today is related, but is different. And I believe that school and district assessment and accountability should also be part of the conversation as we rethink what our expectations are for our students and thus for the schools that they attend. The student body here in the Commonwealth has changed substantially over the past few decades, with far more students of color, immigrants, and English language learners. At the same time, our society continues to change rapidly, with new technology and changing expectations for what a K-12 public education should be able to provide for our students. Our state government owes it to our students, their families, our schools, and our communities that our systems of school and school district assessment and accountability are also evolving and changing. I hope that this briefing today will stimulate a conversation that will lead to new thinking and action from the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education and from the state legislature. All right, let me introduce our speakers today. With us, we have Dr. Jack Schneider from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, who is Director of the Center for Education Policy, which is the home of the Massachusetts Consortium for Innovative Education Assessment, or as we like to refer to it, MCIEA. We will certainly hear more about MCIEA, I expect, in the course of the briefing today. Dr. Schneider is a historian and policy analyst who studies the influence of politics, rhetoric, culture, and information shaping attitudes and behaviors. His work explores why particular ideas gain policy traction, how public perceptions of schools take shape, why education reforms efforts so often fail, and how organizations can use data to empower stakeholders. Dr. Andrew Ho is at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and is the Charles William Eliot Professor of Education. Dr. Ho is a psychometrician whose research aims to improve the design, use, and interpretation of test scores in educational policy and practice. Professor Ho is known for his development of methods for measuring educational progress and educational inequality. He is a developer of a National Archive of Student Achievement Data, CEDA, and an advocate for using educational tests for low-stakes monitoring in multiple measures systems. Also with us, Dr. Nathan Davey, who is the Senior Associate at the National Center for the Improvement of Educational Assessment, or NCIEA. Dr. Davey received his PhD from the University of Boulder, with a concentration in research and evaluation methodology. His main area of research focuses on using psychometric and statistical methods to address practical problems, including issues related to combining interim assessment data, dimensionality, alternative assessments, subscores, and vertical scales. The NCIEA is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization established in 1998 and is committed to improving educational outcomes for all students. Also, we have with us Jessica Tan. Jessica is with the American Federation of Teachers, AFT, as the Vice President of National AFT and is President of AFT Massachusetts. She previously served as the President of the 10,000 member Boston Teachers Union Local 66. She has served as a Vice President for AFT Massachusetts since 2016 and is also currently a Vice President of the Massachusetts statewide AFL-CIO. She's also a founding member of the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance, the Massachusetts chapter, and was appointed as the AFT representative on the National APALA Executive Board in 2017. Noah Berger is with the Massachusetts Teachers Association and heads up their government affairs and policy work. Drawing on a background in legal expertise, he advocates for educators' professional and economic interests. The Mass Teachers Association represents 117,000 members in the Commonwealth across 400 locals throughout the state. Their members include teachers, faculty, professional staff, and education support professionals working in public schools, colleges, and universities statewide. Our final expert today is Superintendent John Cabral. Superintendent Cabral is a highly respected leader with nearly 3 decades of experience in the Taunton public school system. He was appointed as superintendent of schools in 2018 after serving in various other roles in the Taunton schools, including as a social studies teacher, a principal, and the assistant superintendent for finance and operations. He earned his bachelor's at Benedictine University, holds a master's in integrated studies from Cambridge College, and a certificate of advanced graduate study in education leadership from Fitchburg College. He's also a member of the Mass Association of School Superintendents Legislative Committee, the Mass Urban Superintendents, the Reeds Collaborative Board, and the South Coast Educational Collaborative. And he is joining us today representing the Mass Association of School Superintendents. Again, really can't say how much I appreciate all of you taking time from your busy schedules to be with the committee today. All the work you put into preparing for the briefing, and all the very helpful information you will be sharing with us today. I also want to introduce one other committee member who's joined us. Representative Judith Garcia is with us as well. I very much appreciate the House and Senate committee members who are also joining us and participating today. And again, as a reminder to the committee members, we want this to be as interactive and robust a conversation as possible. So each time I open it up for questions and discussion, feel free, obviously, Senator Jalen, you're here in person, just indicate to me if there's something you want to ask or add. And anyone online, Rob, they should just raise their hand. If you're online, just raise your hand and we'll recognize you anytime you also want to participate in the discussion today. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Professor Schneider to start us off by maybe taking 5 to 10 minutes, just giving us sort of an overview of how the current public school assessment and accountability system in Massachusetts, based on the laws, the regulations, practices, how it's, I guess, it's supposed to work, how it actually works, kind of level set the discussion today.
Yep. Great. Thanks, Senator Lewis, and thanks to the committee members who are with us today. So I'm going to err on the side of brevity, given the fact that, as any of my students at UMass can tell you, I can fill as much space as you are willing to give me. I am like a gas that way. So if you all want to dive deeper into how the system works prior to turning to other folks who are here to offer their insights, I'm happy to elaborate a little bit further. Let's start with the indicators that are included in the accountability system. So everybody will be familiar with MCAS. MCAS comes in two different flavors in our accountability systems. The first is the so-called achievement indicator. So for this, we get average composite scaled scores. So this is essentially what a student scored on MCAS for English language arts, mathematics, and science. ELA and math are for grades 3 through 8, as well as 10th grade, and science is done at 3 different points of time. Then we get the student growth version of MCAS, and the psychometricians who are here will be on the hook for speaking to how SGP is calculated, as well as if people want diving into the ways in which SGP is a sometimes controversial way of trying to assess student growth. So think of this not as how a student scored this year, but how a student made progress from one year to the next. For high schools, we include high school graduation. And for all schools, we then additionally, in addition to MCAS in its 2 forms, we include progress towards English language proficiency, if that subgroup is large enough, as well as the so-called additional indicators. And we're not going to dive too much into that other than to say it's primarily chronic absenteeism. So these are the basic components of the system. And then the way in which they are weighted, simply put, is the vast majority of the weight is on MCAS, with the majority of the MCAS weight being placed on proficiency indicators. So if we're talking about non-high schools, so this would be schools serving any grades other than 9 through 12, whether they be elementary schools, middle schools, combined schools, 60% of the overall accountability weighting is going to be placed on MCAS proficiency. So this is the so-called achievement score. This is if they have enough students who are English language learners in order to count progress towards English language proficiency. If they have a subgroup of ELs that is too small for that indicator to kick into gear, then 67.5% of a non-high school's overall accountability determination is based on the achievement score. So this is the overall MCAS score, average in ELA, math, and science. The rest of the majority of the accountability determination for non-high schools is SGP. So this is the student growth version of MCAS. So for schools that have a large enough population of English language learners that we count the progress toward English language proficiency indicator, then SGP is 20% of the calculation. If that subgroup is too small, then it's 22.5. So you can add these numbers together. It's between 80 and 90% of the overall accountability determination for non-high schools is some form of MCAS. The remaining 10% for schools that don't have the progress toward English language proficiency indicator is chronic absenteeism. And if there is a large enough population of ELs at the school, then that's 10%. So that explains why it would be either 80% or 90% that would be tied to MCAS in one of its 2 flavors. For high schools, you can take all of that and just map in one more indicator, which is high school completion. So high school completion is 20%, and that reduces the overall weight on MCAS in that same measure. So 10% for chronic absenteeism, 10% for progress toward English language proficiency in schools where there are enough English language learners for that indicator to count, and then the rest is MCAS. So between 40 and 47.5% for the achievement score, and between 20 and 22.5% for student growth. So this would be 60 to 70% rather than 80 to 90%. Schools are categorized by the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education based on their performance on these indicators. And DESE right now categorizes schools into either schools requiring assistance or intervention, or schools not requiring assistance or intervention. Schools requiring assistance or intervention are identified one of 2 ways, either being in need of so-called broad/comprehensive support, and this is if they're designated as underperforming or chronically underperforming, and this is done at the discretion of the commissioner. So there is no formula that leads to this designation. This is the commissioner's discretion. A slightly less severe way of labeling schools is as in need of focused/targeted support. And so this would be schools that were not identified as being in need of broad/comprehensive support, but who nevertheless are among the lowest 10% of schools statewide as measured by the accountability percentile, which we just discussed the components of a moment ago. Have one or more low performing student subgroups. We can talk about all of the different subgroups if you like. Or in the case of high schools, have low graduation rates below, currently, I think the figure is 66.7%. Also, if too many families opt their students out of testing, then DESE can categorize those schools as being in need of focused and targeted support. Among the other schools, there are 4 categories. They used to have labels applied to them. Levels were the most recent way of labeling them. They no longer have so-called levels, but they are grouped into 4 categories, either meeting or exceeding targets. That's one level. Substantial progress toward targets. That's a second level. Moderate progress towards targets. That's a third level. And limited or no progress toward targets. That's the 4th level. And so if you say there are 2 levels for schools that are coming under DESE's thumb, and then 4 that are not directly coming under DESE's thumb, we have 6 levels that are no longer labeled as levels, but which nevertheless are categorized that way. So this is the basic format of the state system, and I'm not going to go into any detail about it, but I do think it's worth mentioning at the outset that DESE's official ratings of schools are not the only way that parents, community members, and educators are exposed to different ways of rating, labeling, ranking schools. And so the data that DESE uses, its accountability system, ultimately gets picked up in the Boston Globe, it gets picked up in Boston Magazine, it gets picked up by greatschools.org or niche.com. And there is a much broader impact on public consciousness via those secondary sources than directly from DESE, although the direct impact on schools is felt directly from DESE. And so I'm sure others will talk to the ways in which schools, educators, school leaders, districts, and district leaders respond to this system. Happy to go into more detail on any of that if needed.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schneider. I know that was not easy to summarize the whole system in such a short amount of time, but I think you gave us a very good level set. At this point, I just want to open it up for sort of any clarifying questions from committee members. So we're not going to kind of get into the policy or the substance of it just yet, but just kind of anything that we want to just clarify or understand better about how the current system works or is supposed to work. So let me know if you have something you'd like to ask at this point. Senator Jailer, this one, I just want to, before I hand it over to Senator Jailer, I just want to recognize that Senator Sal DiDomenico has also joined us. And Senator DiDomenico, welcome. We're delighted to have you as well. And again, if you're online and you want to ask a question or make a point, a statement, or participate at any time, just raise your hand so we know and we'll recognize you to speak. All right, Senator Jailer, you have something you want to do?
Might be out of date, but I don't really know what happens to you if you're in level 3 or 4. Yeah, so.
Right. So that has become much vaguer over the past several years. So the state.
Dr. Schneider, sorry to interrupt you. Could I ask you and then other people just, I'm not sure how much we're amplifying, but try to just really speak up.
Sure.
Make sure everyone
Yep.
as well. I don't want to miss anything that any of you say today.
Apologies, I'm sort of naturally quiet, so I'll do my best to speak.
Thank you.
So the guidelines around this are not as clear as they used to be. The state does still maintain the authority to take schools and districts, into receivership. And so that is the ultimate kind of so-called accountability that districts are on the lookout for, is trying not to be the next Lawrence or the next Holyoke. So that is an authority that DESE continues to have, and they do not issue any guidance, any clear There are no stated guidelines for how that determination is made. Then there is federal law for us to consider here. So the state currently in compliance with the Every Student Succeeds Act, which was the 2009. Am I remembering that date correctly? A reauthorization, 2014, 15. Yeah. Thank you. Been a while. Reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, but really an update to NCLP signed into law in 2002, which requires the bottom, I believe it's 5% of schools and districts identified by the state, but there are no clear rules about what needs to happen once those schools and districts are identified. And so over the past several years, we've moved into a much more nebulous area where the levels have been taken off. These schools and districts used to be very clearly labeled, which had very clear consequences for communities. Even though they are still grouped, those labels are not applied, at least to my understanding, in the way that they once were. But DESE still does maintain pretty broad authority with regard to what happens next if schools are identified for intervention.
Anything else from committee, Senator Jalen, or other committee members? Any other clarifying questions at this point about how things are supposed to work today? Okay. All right, good. So obviously a lot more detail we can go into there, but I think it sort of gives us a level set. All right, so next what we want to do is explore where in the views of our experts that are with us today, this current system, where does it fall short? Where are its weaknesses? Where is it not serving our students, families, schools, society at large, what we would want to ideally have from a school assessment and accountability system? The next section of our agenda will be getting into other newer kind of innovative approaches, and so kind of save that, because I know you all have thoughts on that as well. Kind of save that, we'll get there. But for now, let's focus on, I mean, if you think there's some things about the current system that work well, obviously share that as well. But I'm sure most of what we're going to talk about today are where you think the current system, where its weaknesses and drawbacks are failings. So let's dive into that. Maybe if anyone who wants to speak on this topic, I assume you all do, maybe take about 5 minutes. We'll let each of our panelists speak, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussion with the members.
Great.
So you want to start with Caleb?
Sure. Happy to start.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Chair Lewis and Vice Chair Jalen, and fellow senators and representatives. I do have prepared remarks for this section because I want to make sure I stay within my time limits. I'll start.
Notice he looks at me.
Yeah, great. You were under 10. I'll start by mentioning.
Time limits are balance.
I do appreciate you're not going to cut me off the way they do in DC. I'll start by mentioning that what it doesn't say in my bio is that I'm a 16-year resident of Arlington, Massachusetts, represented by Senator Friedman and Representative Rogers, and I'm grateful to witness this kind of deliberation and contribute to your conversations. My bio also doesn't list that I just wrote a review of test-based accountability in K-12 education just this last year. It's publicly available, and so this topic is on my mind. The conclusion of the chapter is that roughly 75 years of educational accountability theory and policy, through that, there is a broad evidence-based consensus about how to do accountability well. As exciting as the idea of innovative and effective accountability might be, I think we can take an opportunity to recenter around this consensus. As a psychometrician, I can tell you there is no innovation, no magic metric or formula that no one has thought of before that will silver bullet us to success. Metrics, formulas, laws, jargons, and buzzwords are only good to the extent they facilitate what really works in education, leadership, teaching, communication, and engagement. So why then does test-based accountability survive and thrive? The reason for the enduring power of testing is that comparative, comparable quantities are convincing. In the right hands, these numbers, this data can help leaders, teachers and legislators persuade us toward progress. I will probably agree with some of my colleagues that we should right-size the system away from test scores. But I will argue that whatever that replaces them must have the same technical quality in terms of comparability, validity, and precision for our intended uses. The reason that conventional testing endures is that it tends to be the cheapest quantity for the job. Do not underestimate the costs of test replacement. So what is this decades-long hidden consensus about accountability? My late colleague, Richard Elmore, calls it reciprocal accountability, and I like to summarize it with these three principles. Number one, multiple measures. Number two, achievable targets. Number three, no stakes without support. Number one, multiple measures. Number two, achievable targets. Number three, no stakes without support. Number one, the logic of multiple measures is simple. If you only have one measure, you can fake it, you can game it, you can cheat it, no matter how you think you have a, quote, test worth teaching to. The antidote to this cynical and fatalistic logic is multiple measures. What does the logic look like in Massachusetts? As Jack mentioned, multiple measures in our system is, if you'll allow me a simplistic metaphor, a four-legged stool: one, achievement; two, growth; three, Yale progress; four, chronic absenteeism, and high schools have a fifth leg of the stool for completion and advanced coursework. That's a simplistic metaphor. You might notice that one of the legs of the stool is disproportionate. As Jack mentioned, test score status is 60%, growth is 20%. So two legs dominate, and they're both tests. I don't mind rebalancing this stool, but as I said, if you want to balance it, you need other stool legs of similar quality, or the stool falls over. Number two, achievable targets. The canonical example of unachievable targets is, as Jack mentioned, the No Child Left Behind Act, which, as you remember, set the goal of 100% proficiency by 2014. This is statistically and logically absurd, a fallacy that confuses the goal we have for one child, which should be proficiency, with the goals we should set for a system. Now, the feds have been out of the target setting business for over a decade, and states have responsibility for target setting. Your own DESE has a target setting document that illustrates this. They have one out for 2026. They set differential glide paths for pandemic recovery, for example. And any effort you undertake should enable responsible target setting informed empirically by what is achievable, and the higher the bar, the higher the support, which leads to the third principle: no stakes without support. Match any goal that requires a stretch with the time and support to reach. If you hold a school or district accountable for results it cannot produce, you build a system for blame, not progress. To the Commonwealth's credit, our own language reflects this. We don't label schools as failures. They, quote, require assistance or intervention or broad and comprehensive support. The label should unlock the support. So how can you provide the support without the blame? In my colleague Beth Schuler's national study of state takeover of districts, like Lawrence here, she looks up to 9 years out and finds, any guesses about the effects of state takeover of districts? Any guesses? No average improvement in student achievement. States increase spending in takeover districts, but the money alone doesn't move the needle. Our own Lawrence had real early gains, but Beth attributed this to acceleration academies with good teachers that former Commissioner Riley had piloted in BPS before Lawrence. The takeover wasn't the ingredient, it was the reform. As you know, these early Lawrence gains plateaued after 2015, and in Holyoke and Southbridge, the results were also limited. The lesson is not that states or state takeover were wrong. It is that stakes without the right leadership, the right capacity, and the right specific interventions are on average noise. To conclude, recenter around established consensus on accountability. Use high quality, multiple measures, and ask not just what do they measure, but what action do they inspire. Uphold the comparability and quality of your measures and ensure they do not create shame, but carry support. That is the consensus, and I look forward to your questions.
Very much. Yeah, maybe we'll come back to you since you get to all, for now, is that okay?
Whatever you want.
We'll go to, Sure.
So I actually do have some prepared remarks, but after listening to these two presentations, I'm gonna wing it a little bit. Because I feel like what I have to offer actually is on the ground perspective of how the accountability system has harmed our students, our teachers, and our school districts. Because I was realizing that this system has been my whole career in Boston Public School. So I've been a Boston Public School teacher since 2005 after graduating from Hugsy. And I've seen the harms. And actually, as you were reading out the whole system, I was actually sitting here kind of seething and being really angry inside because I've personally experienced how much harm it has caused to the students in the schools that I've actually taught in and worked with. So the first place I wanted to start was actually the student impact. And so there's a few different things I want to mention. The first one is the shaming, stigmatizing piece, right? As a middle school teacher, I had a lot of English language learners, and the emphasis on the test and specifically the composite scores and the labeling, and I know the labeling has since changed, but they were very, like does not meet expectations, warning, all that kind of things. And I would have students who had just moved to this country and would have actually grown like 3 years in their English language proficiency, but would yet get, the worst label and feel like they were failing because that was their test score, which was, I think, something we talked a lot about during that time because we had students who were actually making a tremendous amount of progress. But if we know from research, for example, that it takes, 5 to 7 or at least 4 to 6 years, 3 to 5 at best, to become proficient in a new language, then why are we measuring our multilingual learners with the same test and then labeling in the same way and then labeling those schools as failing when in fact you're not showing actually the growth that the students are making, right? And so I came back to one of my schools and, a student who literally didn't speak English in the 6th grade, by the 8th grade was actually giving the graduation speech as the valedictorian of the 8th grade. But you wouldn't know that just by looking at her MCAS scores, right? And so there is a stigma for the students. And I do think it's really, I remember sitting with a group of English language learners in Chinatown actually too, and they were like, yeah, it just makes us feel like we're really like dumb. And I want to name that because there are impacts, unintended consequences for the students that we are trying to help and serve in first place, right? And then the other student impact, I think, is the stress that they're given when they have to take these tests because they are so high stakes. And the way that it happens is because in Boston, we experience this, right? Where not only would they take over the school, but they would justify firing all the teacher, or not firing technically, I guess, but, letting go of all the educators. And it actually became, the worst thing that could happen was to be labeled one of these schools, these chronically underperforming schools, or being in the bottom 10% or being labeled for turnover. And while we didn't have the Lawrence and Holyoke experience, and by the way, we do actually represent Lawrence, so I'm going to talk about that in a second too. But we did have the Dever and the Upholland, which were considered chronically underperforming level 5 schools that were taken over. What we saw there was an incredible amount of disruption. And it wasn't until, 2020, actually this past year, that finally Up is starting to come out of receivership, right? But we had a terrible experience at the school level, and I wanted to read, something that the educators wrote, to the commissioner, Jeff Riley. This was in 2023. So the teachers wrote, there is a lack of clarity of when and how the state takeover will end. And the result is a sense of resignation and powerlessness among staff, a feeling that we will remain, quote, chronically underperforming, end quote, forever, and cannot do anything about it, no matter how hard we work or what we achieve with our students. So that's the impact at the teacher level, right? And the long hours and relatively low pay for educators contributing to high staff turnover rates. And the result, they said, was a predictable one: burnout and high turnover rates, right? And we saw this both at the Dever and the Holland. And then irrational outlier compensation systems that denies educators more compensation for furthering their education. So these are some of the choices that DESE made in their takeover that actually disincentivized our highly skilled, experienced educators that were successful in things like the Acceleration Academy, which I have personal experience doing because I actually taught in Acceleration Academies in Boston before they were brought to Lawrence. And that, and they wrote, that a new approach to chronically underperforming schools is overdue. And they had a lot of examples in their letter to Commissioner Riley at that time. But another letter, this was also from Up Academy Holland, that they said, receivership has created conditions that made it hard for teachers to want to stay at our school. The extended school hours and extended school year we've had for many years under receivership have led talented teachers to seek jobs at other BPS schools instead of returning to UAH. And again, the lack of certainty regarding whether we are exiting has lowered teachers' morale and led to questions about whether they will return next year. At the Dever School, there was a huge school impact in that they actually were given receivership. They were given blueprint. And then under blueprint, they had, I believe, and I can't remember exactly at this point, but it's something like 5 different principals in like 4 years or something like that. And then eventually it went up to Tommy Chang as the receiver. But they, again, had huge turnover and constant, they stopped the dual language program there. A lot of the successes they were seeing were stopped. And that was, again, another disaster. And so when the system is set up for punishment and not support, then it has a lot of really harmful unintended consequences, both for the students and then, of course, for the educators. And then you have the examples of the turnover, the low morale, et cetera. But ultimately, I'll wrap up a little over 5 minutes. It just doesn't work. Right. And we've seen that now in Lawrence and Holyoke, and then schools that have been impacted in Boston, and then nationally, too. We know that the data hasn't looked very great either. And so those are some of the harms. And I just wanted to share kind of the perspective at the school level.
Let's go to Dr. next.
Yeah, my name is Nathan Dady. I'm an associate at the Center for Assessment. I've spent the past 10 or so years helping design, implement, and support innovative assessment systems and innovative accountability systems in a variety of states. And if there's one thing I want folks to take away from this conversation is that implementation matters. It matters a great deal. And as a corollary to that, sustained support and capacity building are key in that implementation. We're not lacking for good ideas. I think there are ideas from the 90s that if we could stand up right now, they'd be fabulous. The issue is getting the right intersection of factors to help support that rollout and implementation. And so I'm just going to remark a little bit on some of the things that I heard raised elsewhere in terms of measuring what matters and how an evaluation system, accountability system can function, right? So I think one thing that may come up in conversation is performance assessment. Performance assessment is not new. There were a lot of states who tried that in the 90s, right? All of those programs petered out over time because it put a burden on adults in the system that were potentially at odds with their own local goals. And I'm not saying that performance assessment is not great. I actually think, for example, with the work of the K-12 Graduation Council, that capstones are the perfect vehicle to reconsider and revisit performance assessment. But what I want to say, right, is when performance assessments are done at the state level, for example, I was involved in the New Hampshire PACE project, which attempted to use performance assessments as the statewide summative assessment under a USED waiver for a number of years. Eventually, those who wanted to do it did it. The rest of the schools and districts did not, right? And there was not enough consensus to move forward. And so I think the question is, how can these types of more innovative approaches be rooted in capacity building, local context, such that they're self-sustaining? Because otherwise they can be done at the systems level and eventually they'll peter out. They may last 4, 5, 8 years, and then there will be remnants in schools and districts doing it, and the state will move on with a different system. And so I think overall, the question I would ask is, what is the behavior that we want to change on the ground? What are the shifts we want to see in instruction that would be motivated by any shift in the system. I'm mirroring Andrew and I hate going after him, but right, if more generally, if the change in the assessment program is a change management tool, we're trying to change the way instructions happen in the classroom, the way administrators act. What are those changes? Can we articulate them? And what is the evidentiary base that supports that? And where are the pitfalls, right? And we can look to the research for performance assessment to see where that happens. Again, I'm not coming down on performance assessment. I think there is huge value in providing students authentic opportunities to engage, but I just want to also have us rooted in history. Next, I want to come to the state's accountability system, right? So there's as I understand it, right, and this is something that I have not spent time on in Massachusetts, but elsewhere, right? The system is in compliance with the federal requirements, which is right to identify schools into 3 categories, and the state system builds on top of that, right? So I conducted, along with some of my colleagues in New Hampshire, one of the more large-scale evaluations of that program. And we found a couple of things. I think the first thing I want to point out is that there's a lot of friction in those systems. And I'll give one example. So when funds come along for the lowest level identification in New Hampshire, that's just the federal language, which is comprehensive support and improvement. That is only allocated year to year. And we've heard schools say, well, we would love to hire a literacy coach. But if I don't know dollars coming in next year and the year after, how can I ever make a commitment to someone and bring it in? And so that's just one pain point amongst many. And so, right, like I would love a world where the state said, okay, well, we're going to level fund you for 3 years after identification. It's that type of pain point that stops good practice from happening and makes high-level systems that have great principles difficult to enact on the ground. One of the other things that I wanted to bring up from the New Hampshire study is those schools over time, in terms of 2 of those legs of the chair, achievement and growth. We looked at New Hampshire's a small state. They were identifying 10 to 12 schools. 8 of them eventually looked very similar to their counterparts who we statistically match. So there was improvement in that system. So it can happen. I think the question is, writ large, what is the process that will support that? Where are the pain points? And where is the system acting counter to what we want? And we have many years of implementation. I think systematic review and pushing on those pain points can help inform this new round of accountability development.
Let's go to Noah Berger.
Hi, no, thank you for inviting all of us, and I think it's a really important conversation to be having, so thank you. I should say I've been working in education policy since the early 90s here in Massachusetts, including the Education Reform Act back in 93. But it's really only the last 5 years when I've been at the MTA that I've had the chance to work really closely with educators in the classroom. And that has incredibly deepened and strengthened my understanding of how these policies actually play out in classrooms and what it actually takes to help students succeed and be able to become the kinds of graduates and adults that we want them to be. So I think my remarks today are going to be a lot reflecting what we're hearing from classrooms all across the state. And Mr. Chairman, you said that a good system should be authentic, robust, and holistic. And listening to Dr. Snyder's description, this is none of those things. It's a system that we now have in Massachusetts that's overwhelmingly focused on standardized tests. And that drives instruction in negative ways in a lot of different ways. I mean, the most obvious is it just encourages educators to focus on test prep, either direct test prep or just in general, teaching things in ways that prepare students to do well on standardized tests, as opposed to actually to master the material and be able to use it in real life experiences on the job or in college or anywhere else that they might be. It also narrows the focus of education. That is, some of our standards, it's actually a minority of our state standards that are tested on MCAS or close to that, which means that there are a lot of things that we just encourage teachers or give disincentives for teachers to teach. And it's not just esoteric. I mean, things like writing a research paper is part of our standards. It's written in a little bit more detail than that. But that's a really important skill if you're going to go to college or work or in a lot of things that you might do next. Being able to do sustained research, having independent thoughts and write that down is important. you can't test that on a standardized test. So it's an incredible disincentive and a focus instead to teach those kinds of things that you can teach on tests. The remarks about the graduation council, I think we're absolutely right that we now have a graduation council that's looked at different ways to assess, to look at capstone projects and portfolios and other forms of authentic assessment. And there's overwhelming evidence that those things work, that they're hard, that you have to take a lot of support to get there. But there are ways of assessing that because students are using the skills in real ways and interacting, mixing different things that they've learned and learning how to present publicly, that the learning is much deeper and is real. And it also engages students so that they know why they're learning what they want to learn. And we could try to build our state accountability system on those kinds of assessments that are actually getting at what we need to know. The third thing is we now have a vision of a graduate as a state. And it's a vision of graduate that I think a lot of people find pretty appealing. And it was the result of a lot of public input from all over the state. If we're serious that that's our vision of a graduate, it might make sense to think about how we could design a district accountability system that could measure, are we helping students to achieve those things that we say that we want them to be able to do and to know. And just to go through the list, most of them are not things that standardized tests are going to be how we encourage people to do them, which means that if our whole accountability system is based on standardized tests, we're driving people away from actually trying to achieve the vision of a graduate. The first part is academically prepared. Standardized tests have perhaps some role in that, but as you're just talking about, they're actually not the best way to judge whether students have learned things in ways that are going to stay with them and show real mastery. We talk about critical problem solvers. That's not what MCAS tests. We talk about self-aware navigators. Again, not something you test on standardized test. Intentional collaborators. When you talk to business leaders, that's a really important skill. And if you think about our democracy, that's a really important skill, not part of a standardized test. Effective communicators and responsible decision makers. So that's what we as a state have decided that we think is important, but we don't have a state accountability system that does anything close to driving progress on those things. Now, it's not easy to do any of that, but if we're serious that that's our vision of graduates, at least we're stepping back and asking the question, what would a system look like if that's where we're going? The next harm, which President Tang talked about at length, so I'm not going to go into detail, is the whole system is based on driving towards punishment and towards receivership. And there's now overwhelming evidence that that doesn't work as a strategy, as several people have said. I think the good thing is it does seem like this kind of a consensus that receivership and state takeovers don't work. Schools and districts are coming out of receivership. There's no energy to put new ones in, as far as I can tell. So it might make sense to just make that official and change our state accountability system away from a system that's built on, a downward trend towards receivership. Finally, and this is sort of referenced, is just the vision of accountability in the current system is all this idea that everyone's accountable to death rather than being accountable to families and communities and each other as all being accountable for making sure that our students can succeed. There's a quote from the National Education Policy Center report that sort of sums that up, where it says the dominant approach to accountability framed by NCLB and ESSA has been unidirectional, focusing on making demands of teachers, principals, and district leaders. A reimagined accountability system must instead be grounded in the idea of reciprocal accountability. School and district leaders should be directly responsible for the education of students, while leaders in federal and state government have an obligation to provide schools with the capacity and resources needed to serve students. Leaders and those who put leaders into power cannot reasonably demand or accept unidirectional accountability. And that goes back to a lot of people were talking about the supports, and these things are hard to do right, and making sure that as a state, we're providing the supports that allows the kinds of real learning that we want to have happen in classrooms and an accountability system that encourages that.
Very much. All right, let's go to Dr. Smith.
Great, thank you. So the question here is, why is the system lacking in improving school performance and student outcomes? That's the thing that we're all focused on. And I think the very first way that we should try to answer this is by looking at the theory of change that is embedded in the system. So when you look at how our assessment and accountability system works, and if you try to derive a theory of school improvement from the system as it presently exists, I think the only reason you would have a narrow set of measures accounting for the vast majority of the accountability score, would be if you think that schools are not sufficiently focused on whatever MCAS can measure in English language arts, math, and to a lesser extent, science. And if you think that narrowing the focus to the exclusion of all of the other things, all of the other subjects that get taught in school, all of the other activities that take place within school is the key to supporting learning, then you have a very narrow understanding of what learning is. This is the theory that is embedded in our current assessment and accountability system, whether anybody believes it or not. That's what it is. And to continue looking for an embedded theory of change here, I would say that the only reason that you would design a system in which accountability is rooted in the threat of sanction that Noah was just alluding to would be if you believe that low performance is the product of an insufficient sense of urgency among educators. And we simply know that that isn't true. And if you all want to get into the chief predictors of low proficiency scores among students, we've got lots of knowledge here about what those predictors are. But everything we know about educators suggests that this embedded theory of change is entirely wrong, and that encouraging educators to work harder by threatening them in a field that people have gotten into precisely because they want to make a difference in the lives of children is a broken theory. And so that's the first way I would answer this question about why is the system lacking in improving school performance and student outcomes? Because it's based on a theory that doesn't map over to the real world. Second, I would say that the system is failing to improve school performance and student outcomes because its design produces very serious unintended consequences, many of which actually undermine student learning. And so some of these unintended consequences are obvious, and I feel like they get lots of airtime, especially when I'm in the room talking about the ways in which art and music education, for instance, just gets squeezed right out of the curriculum. And that matters. But to answer this question about why the system is not improving school performance and student outcomes, I think we can look a little deeper into those unintended consequences and look at some of the less obvious unintended consequences, like alienating students from school, right? So if we think about, let's say, our chronic absenteeism problem, and the embedded theory of change in the current assessment and accountability system is that school leaders, district leaders, and educators are not trying hard enough to get students to come to school. It's their fault. And therefore, we'll build that into the accountability system. And now we'll ratchet up even more pressure on these people who don't care whether or not students are going to come to school. That's the embedded theory. As opposed to if you talk to any student in the Commonwealth at any school and say, why do you come to school? I guarantee you that if you talk to enough of them, you will hear about things like arts and music education. You will hear about things like a love for a particular subject, and maybe it is ELA, and maybe it can be tested by MCAS, but it's also not going to be that. And you're going to hear from kids like my daughter, who goes to Somerville High School, who goes to school because there are some classes where she doesn't know what's going to happen that day, but she knows it's going to feel meaningful. She goes because she has a ceramics studio in her school and she gets to take ceramics every day. She goes because she has just enough time for lunch. She gets treated just enough like a human being that she can run down the street and have lunch with her friend who lives nearby, right? It's so if we treat schools as ecosystems and acknowledge that students only will show up to school and try hard in school and take school seriously if they themselves are taken seriously and treated like complete human beings, I think that helps shine some light on why the currently designed assessment accountability system has failed to produce school improvement. Let's just talk briefly for a moment about teachers and unintended consequences. Jessica was alluding to this earlier. Right? So in addition to the unintended consequences that we see affecting students, affecting student motivation, affecting student self-perception, the way they understand themselves as learners, we can also think about what our current assessment accountability system does in its current design to drive teachers away from particular schools, to demoralize teachers in certain schools, which Jessica was reading you a letter in evidence of, and in deprofessionalizing teaching. So again, I think if the question is, why is the system lacking in improving school performance and student outcomes? Let's look at the embedded theory of change in this system. And I think this question is not a very difficult one to answer. Finally, and Noah was alluding to this earlier, the present system marginalizes or renders impossible a range of approaches to school improvement that we know support student learning. So here I'm thinking of a kind of holistic and democratic approach to school improvement, right? Approaches that get school leaders, educators, and communities excited about the work of school improvement. And I'll tell you, our state requires every school to have a school site council that annually produces a school improvement plan. This should be an amazing process, right? The school principal is required to be on the school improvement council. It is required to have, if it's a high school, at least one student. It's required to have educators, and it's required to have parents and community members on it. I have served on school improvement councils, and I have talked to a lot of people who've been on these councils. And what you learn after your first naive year, when you think this is about actually figuring out how to improve your school and make it better reflect your community, the things that educators know and the things that kids care about and value. The thing you learn after that naive year is that if you do that, your plan goes in a file drawer. That's the best outcome. The worst outcome, the more realistic outcome, is it gets recycled. Or I guess there's a worse, less environmentally friendly outcome, which is just gets thrown in the trash. Right? Because the only improvement that matters is improvement on the narrow set of indicators that are captured in our current assessment accountability system. And finally, I would say the current system totally ignores this issue of capacity building, which has now come up over and over and over again. So why, let me come back to the question again, why is the system lacking in improving school performance and student outcomes? Because we know that to improve learning and school outcomes, if you assume, contra the embedded theory, that the reason schools are struggling with those outcomes is not because people aren't trying their hardest, but it's because they don't have whatever they need in order to produce the outcomes they desire, then the obvious answer is to build their capacity. So I subscribe to that theory of school improvement. I believe that everyone's already working really hard. And if the results aren't there, then maybe the capacity isn't there. And it sounds to me like the other folks who are up here agree with me on that one.
Very much. Superintendent Cabral unfortunately had to leave something came up, but he has sent us what he was planning to share. He had just kind of prepared remarks, so don't mind. Liz is going to just read those, so we're kind of into the record of the hearing today, so we can get to hear directly from one of our superintendents. Please go ahead.
Okay, Superintendent Cabral, Senator Lewis, Representative Gordon, and members of the Joint Committee. On behalf of the Massachusetts Association of School Superintendents and the school district leaders we represent across the Commonwealth, thank you for the opportunity to testify regarding the future of Massachusetts school and district accountability system. Mass believes deeply in accountability. Accountability is essential to maintaining public trust and ensuring that every student, regardless of zip code, income, race, language, or disability, has access to an excellent public education. At its best, accountability drives transparency, identifies inequities, and most importantly, leads to continuous improvement. As the Commonwealth develops the next generation of accountability, our primary recommendation is straightforward. Include practicing superintendents as full partners in the design, development, implementation, and continuous refinement of the new accountability framework. Superintendents lead this work every day. Every practical experience that can help ensure the system is both ambitious and effective. We believe the next accountability system should focus on continuous improvement rather than compliance, recognize both student achievement and student growth, measure multiple indicators of school quality, including academic performance, attendance, school climate, student engagement, post-secondary readiness, educator effectiveness, and access to rigorous coursework. Differentiate supports based on district context while maintaining high expectations for every student. Provide meaningful technical assistance and resources, not simply identify schools for intervention. And encourage innovation, collaboration, and sharing of effective practices across districts. Most importantly, accountability should be designed to build district capacity so every public school becomes stronger for the students it serves. The Commonwealth's goal should not simply be to identify struggling schools. It should be to ensure that every school has the capacity, resources, and support necessary to succeed. Massachusetts has earned its reputation as a national leader in public education by pairing high expectations with thoughtful investments in students, educators, and school systems. We have an opportunity to build an accountability framework that is rigorous, transparent, equitable, and fundamentally designed to improve outcomes, not simply measure them. Mass is committed to being an active partner in this work. We welcome the opportunity to work alongside the legislature, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, educators, families, and community partners to help design an accountability system that reflects the realities of today's schools while preparing Massachusetts for the future. Thank you for your consideration and for your continued commitment to the students and public schools of the Commonwealth.
Right, thank you, Superintendent McGraw and the Mass Association of Schools Superintendents for sharing their perspective as well. All right, so we're going to open it up to committee members, questions, discussion. Try to keep that focused on what we were just hearing from our experts in terms of some of what they see as issues with strengths and weaknesses of kind of the current system that we use. Let's focus our questions on that. As a reminder, we will move next to discussing kind of alternative approaches that have been tried here or being tried elsewhere. Experience has been with those, so that will kind of be coming next. Anyone, Senator Jalen or anyone online have anything you want to talk about at this point? Anyone online, Rob? No, okay. Well, keep thinking. I'll kick things off. So a number of you spoke obviously about, not unsurprisingly, the role of standardized tests. In Massachusetts, of course, that's the MCAS. And you spoke about problems, limitations of standardized tests, various issues, kind of how it narrows the curriculum and what teachers teach. You talked about some of the unintended consequences of those, some of the advantages of of standardized tests in terms of the, I guess the sort of the, we talked about this, right? The ability to implement them at scale. One thing you didn't talk about that I'm curious about is, it also seemed to me that there is, I don't know, ironclad is too strong a word, but you could tell me based on research that, I'll use that word, an ironclad correlation between test scores, at least the proficiency test scores, set aside the growth metric, but proficiency, and the demographics of a student population. So where we see essentially a lower income student population, which very often tends to be large, overlap with students of color, overlap with lots of English language learners, those tend to, that there's a very high correlation with lower proficiency scores. So it has always seemed to me that essentially then the tests are just measuring the demographics of that population. Can you speak to that? Am I right about that? Is that what the research shows? Is it more subtle than that? And why is that not something that is in and of itself a disqualifier for using tests to evaluate schools? And essentially it's just evaluating what the demographics is of that. Everyone jump in and we'll follow each other.
I might start here just because you mentioned in my bio that I have this national data set that I've developed with Sean Reardon and Aaron Faley and Ben Shear over many years that actually shows in a scatter plot like the correlation at the district level between socioeconomic status and parental wealth and grade level performance across state standardized tests and the National Assessment of Educational Progress. So at the district level, this is actually the first exercise I do with my students in the first day of class. What is the correlation? The correlation is between 0 and 1. 1 means ironclad. The more socioeconomic status a district has, the higher the achievement. It's a line. And 0 means there's no relationship at all, regardless of your socioeconomic status of your district. It's the district level. Like you don't know anything. You can't tell anything. Can't predict anything about overall performance. So whenever I hear ironclad, I'm like, well, it's not 1. Guess what it is? And this is one of those, I'm not afraid to be wrong. If I'm wrong, I just haven't learned it yet kind of statements. And between 0 and 1, district level correlation Nationwide, all 12,000 some odd districts.
So only looking at proficiency scores, not growths.
That's correct. Very good question. That's correct.
I'm gonna guess it's not one, because as I said, I qualified, it's probably not ironclad, but it's probably pretty close to one.
Any guesses? We go for quantities here. Don't afraid to, we're not gonna enter your name into the record.
I wanna hear what's in the jail.
Between 0 and 1.
Do that. Anyone online?
We can put it into the Zoom chat. We promise not to record. So the answer is 0.8. Very good, Jessica. So is the Hugsy education issues, education free. So 0.8 is the correlation between, and so again, not ironclad, but if you look, what's fascinating about correlations is that if you look at any slice, there remains a lot of variation. And one of those slices that we compare two states, one that's really high on the scatter plot, which is to say, if you have the same socioeconomic status, there's one state that's pretty high, and there's another state that's pretty low. And we show this just to illustrate it's not ironclad. It's about controlling for socioeconomic status. You have about 2 grade levels, 1.5 grade levels of difference between one state and the other. And the state we show is Massachusetts versus California. And guess which one's higher? Massachusetts, right? So which is to say that although there is this relationship, it can nonetheless reveal that there are differences, even controlling for socioeconomic status. I'll also note that the individual level for individual students, I was talking about district correlations. At the individual level, our best guess is around 0.3, 0.35. So not ironclad at the student level. At the district level, which is where a lot of us are acting because we have local control, it's more like 0.8, but there's nonetheless meaningful variation such that states like Massachusetts, controlling for socioeconomic status, outperform Texas, outperform California by noticeable amounts. And that's worth knowing. And I think I think one of the things we're fighting against as we're trying to improve this accountability system is the widespread knowledge that Massachusetts relatively does well on average and controlling for many other sociodemographic backgrounds. So I think that is one of the things we have to face, because you're facing a lot of pressure from folks saying, we've always done it this way. We're tops in the NAEP rankings. So what's the problem? And the answer is everything you testified to, but there is going to be some pushback from people who are like, well, even though there's a relationship, who's breaking that pattern? We are, and we have. And so can we, not throw out the good, the improvement, the high performance, while still improving on the very real complaints and issues that you and I and many of my fellow testifiers here today share. So I will say it's not ironclad, and it's empirically known, and it is changeable, right? Progress happens.
Can I just follow up?
Of course.
Now, that 0.8, that correlation is nationwide. Do you know what that number is just for districts in Massachusetts?
That's knowable. So yeah, the data is publicly accessible and available.
Massachusetts.
Yep, we have a graph for you right here. Like I can pull it up for you. I think it's probably a little bit higher. So which is to say that the relationship in Massachusetts is a little bit stronger than it is in other districts. But I'll need other states.
There's even stronger correlation in Massachusetts.
That's right.
Between the socioeconomics of the district and the student test scores.
That's right. Yeah.
So may I just add something to that? Because I consciously did not bring this up today for precisely the reason that Andrew just named. This is well known. We know this. And so in my mind, it's worth exploring the many other reasons why we would want to change our assessment and accountability system. And it's not absent from my thinking in what I'm planning to recommend about where we go, this fact. But it's relatively easy to solve. And I think people here will agree with me that that correlation becomes not a problem if there are no stakes. And it becomes not only not a problem, but it becomes something that I don't think anybody would have any qualms with if help is on the way. Once you are identified as not meeting your academic targets. And I think people would be comfortable with the idea that if proficiency rates correlate with historic patterns of exclusion and marginalization, and that is then met with capacity building efforts to redress the kinds of lingering historical harm that lead to lower proficiency rates on average across marginalized, minoritized, and oppressed groups. It becomes something that we don't need to worry about or talk about anymore in an accountability system. The problem is when you associate proficiency rates, as we do so strongly, as I was mentioning at the outset, with labels and formal kinds of punishment. That's when it becomes a problem. But this correlation in and of itself is not a problem. It's just an empirical fact. And the problem is a result of the way our accountability system then responds. And if the response was different, the fact itself would not be a problem.
But put another way, another test is not going to change that correlation substantially. It's what you do about it.
Well, I want to come back to that in a second, but let's hear from Jessica.
Well, if you want to elaborate on that, feel free.
I'm taking too much time.
No, I just wanted to point out a couple of things. One, I remember actually going to DESE and sitting down with the folks at DESE because I was trying to better understand like how SGP is calculated, which I think is still very much a mystery to most people. And trying to
tell everyone what that.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, the student growth percentage and why it was like the percentage that it was. And I remember asking, well, why isn't it like 50-50 at least, right? Like half growth and then half composite, because shouldn't growth count more? And the response that still haunts me was, well, if we did that, then we wouldn't be able to target the low income districts that we're trying to help. Because DESE, I actually do think they were trying to help the low income districts, right? But I think that in and of itself explains why it correlates so strongly, is because that was the goal, was be able to target the low income districts and particularly low income urban districts, right? And so that's, I think, something that we need to talk about is does that really do us a service or a disservice? Particularly, I think, in higher income, wealthier, more resource districts, where there actually are some of the biggest gaps when you disaggregate data between the students of color and or low income students and other students in those districts, right? And so it's masked oftentimes because on average, those school districts do very well, but the gaps oftentimes are actually higher there, right? So I think that's something to think about when we're thinking about recommendations and solutions. I also wanted to, the point about the whole underlying assumption of the current system is that teachers aren't trying hard enough. And we've seen that time and time again. That's why just like turning over the teachers doesn't work. And in fact, it destabilizes our schools a lot and rips apart relationships. I don't think anyone mentioned that yet, but the harm of this actually has been that communities that where trust is really important in schools and relationships actually get ripped apart because of the high turnover. And also this, when they used to just like, move out a bunch of educators in a school. And then the other thing I wanted to mention too was the teaching to the test part. I remember talking to a lot of people oftentimes were like, that doesn't actually happen. And I'm like, no, it does. I was a social studies teacher and I only got to teach social studies half the year to half the students at a time because the rest of the time was spent on ELA and math. And then when I started teaching humanities, we actually had to stop for our unit on like vignettes to teach MCAS writing and evidence, like how to, write MCAS responses in a way where you get, the 4 or whatever. And it really does happen. And so I wanted to, something I learned about is something called Campbell's Law. And I thought maybe you'd be best to explain that.
I had it in my remarks. I had to cut it for time, but yeah.
Oh, okay. But I do think Campbell's Law is a big cause of the, you can explain it better.
Any indicator that becomes a target stops being a good indicator, right? So if you hold Jaylen Brown accountable for hitting shots, he's going to hit shots but become a bad teammate, right? If you hold surgeons accountable for the success of their surgeries, they're going to gravitate towards low risk cases, right? And in every one of these situations, you're going to game the system, cheat the system for this single indicator, which is why we advocate for multiple measures.
And that was actually the second thing I was going to say, is then it creates a disincentive for teachers to actually teach the students who may not test well because they're students with disabilities or multilingual learners. And that creates, I think, a perverse incentive of who teaches who, and not getting, our most experienced and, highly qualified educators to be in those places. So I just want to share that.
I have a quick question, because could you say a little bit more about Campbell's Law and sort of how that plays out in the context of like high stakes standardized testing in a state like Massachusetts, in terms of do we get more accurate results when we attach high stakes to tests?
No. So the answer is no. So my colleague Dan Koritz basically took Campbell's Law and applied it to high stakes testing. Many of you might know he's wrote a famous book called Measuring Up, which basically digs into this hypothesis. This theory, really, I call it Koretzian inflation theory. That if you put high stakes on a single test or a small number of tests, people will slowly inflate that outcome over time in predictable ways. He brings compelling evidence, in particular from New York and Kentucky, that shows when at the advent of a high stakes system, you get unreasonably large test score gains that are not borne out by the National Assessment of Educational Progress, NAEP, the gold standard. So he documents this. But even he would say, like what I was saying, Richard Elmore said, there is a known antidote to Campbell's Law. It shouldn't be fatalistic that we can't do anything about this. And Jack has some solutions, we have some solutions, but as I mentioned, multiple measures, achievable targets, and no stakes without support. It is the feeling that there is an unreasonable goal that you do not have the support to achieve that creates this cynicism, this narrow focus on a singular outcome. And digging into it, it's a little funny because you're like, actually, you can't pay attention to many outcomes, so we can't game them all. And that's why it works in some way, is that you pick 10 instead of 2, and that dramatically changes the way we behave and respond.
Yep, go ahead.
Couple quick remarks. I think one, particularly the relationship between test scores and socioeconomic statuses and the interpretation, right? And so one is in the interpretation of what that means, right? And so another interpretation is that higher levels of adequate resourcing leads to more opportunities to learn. That's a different interpretation. And both can be true, right? It can be reflective of systematic disadvantage, lack of resources, et cetera. I think one thing that I would like to advocate is let's separate some concerns here. So here's 2 questions we should ask. One, does the current system identify the right schools? Or not even the right schools, but some schools that need support? That is a fundamental question, right? So if the schools are, everyone in the Commonwealth looks at them and says, those schools need help, right? Then you would say we're correctly identified. Then we can move on to the question, are they getting the right support? I think actually my understanding of the Massachusetts state accountability system is there's much to be commended. There's coaching, there's turnaround plans, there's funding provided in some conditions, right? All of that is good. So I think the questions are, what are the aspects of the current system that are supportive of state practice, and what should, from a pain point capacity building perspective, be reconsidered? And so I think, right, like to build on that red flag idea is state tests are cheap, right? Cheap relative to every other thing we could do. So one of the questions is another view of the theory of action is we want to identify schools that probably need help. Then there's a process to understand what they actually need. Because under an ESSA system, which Massachusetts is compliant is, there's a red flag, then there's a needs assessment, a development of a school improvement plan, and a variety of other activities that are brought in. And to some degree, often what, in my experience, those school improvement plans focus on is less so the academics, but for example, we've had unstable leadership for 4 years, right? We've had an inadequate system of multi-tiers, right? So I think in our thinking and in the thinking moving forward, separate the concerns of, is it the identification that's wrong and needs, or the identification that needs to be reconsidered? We're just looking at the wrong schools. Is it that some parts of the support that are being provided need to be reconsidered? Some parts of both. And then I think subsequent to those questions, we can also consider the ways in which assessment is signaling or not signaling undesirable actions.
Trying to figure out where to start, because there's a lot of complicated issues intertwined. And I think this idea that if we're identifying some schools that need support and we're able to provide support, that's a positive thing. I think there's a real question about whether you actually need these tests to do that. That is, to the extent they're correlated with income and poverty, maybe that's our measure. To the extent it's like instability in leadership, that's something you can observe directly. A lot of these other things are things you can observe directly and provide support. And frankly, a lot of these may be supports we should have in every single school in the Commonwealth. And we shouldn't just say, you get them for 2 or 3 years if your test scores are down, and if your test scores go up, you lose them. That goes into the problem that maybe what you really need is long-term sustainable progress. So it just feels like, yeah, if our measure is just correlating with poverty, then we're providing supports to those schools, fine. But that's a whole lot of other bad unintended consequences come in along the way, which is that schools don't actually think about it that way. They don't say, let's ignore this test because we're going to get more money. They do exactly the opposite and say, we want to show that we can do well on this test because it's high stakes, we get put into receivership. And therefore, instead of doing things that we all know help kids to learn and to really master material, they're spending a lot, as Jessica was describing, so much time just doing test prep that to the extent there's any positives, those are almost all positives you could get in some other way more directly.
If you pick up on that and you kind of circling around this, so it was interesting when Jessica said, Desi's response was, well, we want to target the low income districts because we know. So if it seems to me we accept the fact that districts that serve large populations of low income students, again, which tends to overlap a lot with disadvantaged students, bringing all kinds of challenges to school. We know that there's a big difference when you have concentrated poverty. That was a big part of the Student Opportunity Act to recognize that brings with it different challenges than when you have a small number of low-income students, otherwise relatively affluent community. If that's the case, we don't need an assessment and accountability system to direct more resources to that. In fact, that was what the Student Opportunity Act reform is supposed to do, is through the Chapter 70 to direct more resources. We can debate whether that's still sufficient and what more. It seems to me an assessment and accountability system should really be getting at what is the essential quality of a school. And I don't know exactly how to measure it. I know we have multiple indicators and we're going to talk more about that. But I know when I go into school, when I walk into a school and I can see from the top the principal of that school, the energy, the excitement, knows all the students, the teachers are excited to be there.
Great morning.
They are. I can just see when I walk in a classroom, the energy from the students, how they're participating, how they're paying attention, how the students are engaged, that people feel supported in that community, they feel valued. You can just feel the culture is positive and energetic. It's just a lot of things that maybe are subjective, but I certainly feel that difference when I go into one school versus another. And I assume what we are trying to achieve here is where you have two schools that are, let's say they're serving an identical student population. Demographics are the same, right? But there are some things that one school is doing that makes that what we would consider a higher quality, higher performing school than the other. And the same with two schools that are serving affluent population. Let's say it's an affluent, largely white, privileged population. Again, we will, I'm sure, see examples where one school again we would see as a higher quality achieving school than another. I would think what we want from an assessment accountability system is to be able to pick up those differences, regardless of the population being served, whether it's a less affluent, more diverse, less diverse, more English learners, fewer English language learners, and be able to pick that up and then help drive the schools that are, lower quality to improve. Is that fair? Would that be what we ultimately want from a system, or is that just unachievable? Is that not the theory of change we should be pursuing? How do you think about that?
I'm happy to jump in again. This is again, Dan Koretz is one of my mentors and one of the people who brought me to Harvard. So full credit to him for this idea. But he wrote a book called The Testing Charade, so you can guess where he stands. But he, at the end of his book, that's one of his recommendations, to have like an inspectorship sort of systems like they do in other countries, where people take all available data, including test scores, but also visit schools. We do the same thing in academic departments, right? We have people visit and evaluate with all available data and observe classes and hear from students and hear from different audiences. These models exist in other countries, and I'm sure some states have done them before. It is not, it's not a new idea, and it has benefits of balancing quantitative and qualitative information. But I don't want to, so that first, I think that's a great idea, and I would love it if people made progress on that from a policy perspective. But I don't want to lose this idea that test scores certainly do correlate. You could say that they illuminate and also exacerbate inequality, right? That's what they do. But you mentioned the difference between proficiency and growth. And I want to get back to this because Jessica mentioned this as well. One of the things that correlates much less with socioeconomic status, and sometimes negatively, is growth. And what you can sort of do is, even with the test scores we currently have, set up a sort of 2x2 grid. High proficiency, high growth. You applaud those schools and districts, you'll leave them alone, right? What about the high growth, low proficiency, right? That we are currently counting 20% growth, 60% proficiency. That's got it. We should be able to distinguish those two stories, right? If there's low proficiency, high growth, you credit them, you learn from them, you continue to give them resources, and you have lessons learned for other districts. What about high proficiency, low growth? High proficiency, low growth. I would say monitor, continue to measure, leave, if they're at the 90th percentile, they'll go down to the 85th. Look, with all due respect, the state has other things to do. Leave them alone, monitor them, continue, and then low proficiency, low growth. That's a real concern. That's not just like low socioeconomic status or demographics or anything. That's like students are getting much worse than expected, even given all the information we have. And in those cases, what to do is the right question, as Nathan was saying, but that's where we act. And so I wish we, instead of mushing the 20% with the 60%, we take the more judgmental approach and say, given this information, what should we do? And we should have a sort of 2x2 where we really reserve state action and by the way, support everyone who's low proficiency, because we are, as you said, we already know who those people are, correlates so strongly. But growth does give us a good signal of where we're underperforming, and there should be, in my judgment, some kind of state intervention.
I get why even have 4 boxes? Why don't I have 2 boxes? High growth, low growth, and we're just looking to see if you've got high growth. Okay, you're doing something right. I'm not saying you don't.
Look, if Lexington goes down from the 95th percentile to the 85th percentile, I'm not sure we need to bother them too much. That's a value judgment.
Efficiency in there just to know you don't necessarily need to target.
And they don't need. I don't think they need more resources from the state to help, Lexington. Again, and I don't have these. Actually, do have these data, but that was just a story.
Because if they're all doing well, then they don't have as far to grow. And so they might have low growth, but if they have high proficiency, it's not that they need support or help necessarily. But I'd want to disaggregate the data to see.
Which groups?
Right.
Fair.
Right.
But the other thing about, so I think also part of it, Lexington, I'm not going to say, the town that is low growth or high proficiency might be they've decided they don't have to worry about preparing for tests anymore, and they're doing something else very useful. But I think that goes to a broader point. Like, sort of in theory, a lot of what you said makes sense, but we don't know that high growth means the kids are learning. We know it means that they're getting better test scores. And it might be that those are the districts that are focusing more time and attention on test prep. So you said be careful, and that what we're measuring is what we really want to be measuring.
This is to be continued, obviously. So let's move from here, and we'll kind of continue. I'm sure these threads and themes throughout the discussion. Let's move to sort of now talking more about so what are some of the other approaches that are being tried in Massachusetts. I assume we can talk a bit about NCIA, but also other parts of the country. You mentioned what New Hampshire has tried, Dr. Dady, and you can tell if that's still in place or if that fizzled out. But some of the principles Dr. Ho was about in terms of multiple indicators and how those indicators are used. And what the consequences are based on those indicators. So give us, I guess, the committee members a sense of what's the universe of possibilities that are out there? And I think as part of this conversation, it would be helpful to know what we think. What are those indicators other than proficiency and growth, which we were just talking about? What are other indicators that are high quality indicators that meet various standards we would have for measurability, comparability, et cetera, that are ones we would be confident in using to say this is a high quality, high performance school, or this is a school that is in need of improvement. So let's move to that part of the discussion. Anybody in particular want to kick us off?
Should we go with that side and move this way this time?
Yeah, and feel free to
Not
go
put you
back
on the spot now.
to obviously.
I think MCIA would be a great place to start.
Yes.
Sure, I've been nominated to start. I'm happy to do it. I'm going to start in an unexpected place, which is to say, in terms of alternate approaches that are worth considering, I would start with an alternate approach that does not presume that the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education is ever going to have the capacity to work directly with as many schools as require support. I do not believe that state departments of education are where change is going to be led from, because I don't think they ever will have the ability, even in a small state like Massachusetts, to work directly with hundreds of schools. They will never have that ability, nor do I think that a state department of education is ever going to be able to understand what's happening inside schools in the way that you were describing. That you walk into a school and you are able to understand things that the state will never be able to see in a spreadsheet. And so I think one alternative approach worth considering is one that allows us to be in compliance with federal law, but which nevertheless begins to think about accountability as something that belongs to communities and to families, and that helps them become informed. And then our standards for measurement, and I'm aware that I am basically surrounded by psychometricians right now.
Just a couple.
But our standards for measurement can then begin to come down as we are using more than just multiple indicators, a plethora of indicators that can be a little bit squishier, because we now have many different so-called raters or evaluators working together in teams, drawing on what they can see, drawing on who they can talk to, and drawing on lots of other kinds of measures in order to make determinations. This is a vision of accountability that is actually within reach. It is legal, it is possible to pursue. And I was nominated to go first because I can tell you a little bit about MCIEA, but this is part of this philosophy of MCIEA is that accountability should be not to the commissioner of education in the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. It should be to the taxpayers across the Commonwealth and in the local community who are bearing 91% of the cost of education. It should be to the families and the students who are inside our schools. It should be to the educators and the leaders who are spending a minimum of 180 days, but far more than that, working to build their communities up and to care for the students in their schools and their classrooms. So I'll talk very briefly about MCIA because I've now used most of my time saying, like, I think that the best thing that we can do in considering alternative approaches is to remove this false set of walls within which we have been working. But, you know, MCIA, the Massachusetts Consortium for Innovative Education Assessment, we do a couple things. One is performance assessment. And our theory behind performance assessment is not that it can immediately and in the long term become a stand-in for standardized tests, but rather that it is worth pursuing in every possible feasible way, because students and educators should feel that the work they're doing matters. Educators should feel like they have some control over what's happening inside their classrooms. Students should feel like the work that they're actually doing matters. They should take pride in it. Community members ought to be able to come in and see that work. We've seen it. One of our districts is Attleboro, which has this incredible night where the whole community comes and sees what students have spent the last week, month, semester working on. And that those are very real benefits. And that if we put aside this false question of, well, is it going to satisfy the psychometricians at DESE who want to see levels of reliability that, right? So we could have measures that are very high in terms of validity. Are you measuring what you think you're measuring? But low in terms of reliability. Oh, well, we're not getting the same score every time for the same kind of work because it's just a messier form of measurement, right? This is a false dichotomy where we have to choose between the kinds of indicators that would satisfy folks at DESE and then, on the other hand, we have stuff that won't satisfy them and we can't use it. I think that we can think much more broadly and we can think then about things like performance assessment, which is a really meaningful way of assessing what students know and can do and can be layered in multiple ways, including as we're talking now for the graduation council. And then the other side of our work is what we call school quality measures, multiple measures, but not just multiple measures. These are indicators that community members, educators, school leaders, district leaders, families, and students themselves. And when I say community members, I mean even those who had to participate with translators for Mandarin, Cantonese, Korean, Haitian Creole, Spanish, Portuguese, Arabic. I'm sure I'm forgetting a couple of other languages. We brought people together in roughly a dozen districts across the Commonwealth, all of these groups, and said, what does a good school do? And they did a lot of what you were talking about, Senator Lewis. They said, well, students should be engaged. Students should feel safe. Students should feel like they belong. The curriculum should be culturally responsive. And so one of the things that we try to do with MCIA is let's try to capture that, not so that DESE can then tinker with its algorithm by taking one little piece of what we do and layering it into the existing system, but rather so that community members can come together, have a common language for talking about what they value in schools so they can see a variety of data, not as the end of the story, certainly not as an algorithm, but that they can use to inform further questioning, further inspection, further conversations so that they can become informed, so that school leaders and educators can be communicating clearly with parents, with families, with community members, and so that we can drive a different kind of meaningful accountability that actually does result in school improvement. I know I've gone over, I know I've talked less about MCIA than I've probably said.
Absolutely. So if what would that look like? What would those actual indicators be that give that information to the families, the students, community at large, that the students are engaged in learning, that the educators feel supported and valued, that the curriculum is culturally responsive? How would you actually measure that?
So two different questions. What are the indicators and how would you measure it? So the indicators, we've got, I think, 36 different indicators, and they are all listed on the MCIA webpage. And so I'm happy to share that afterwards with people. We also have a data dashboard that is open source that can be used by anybody, anywhere. And then in terms of how you measure it, a few different ways. So one is you can use data that is currently being reported to DESE. DESE collects a lot more data than it includes in its accountability algorithm. Second, you can look to districts themselves for data that is not reported to DESE, but which nevertheless offers a kind of meaningful insight. So for instance, DESE doesn't calculate how many minutes on average of art a student gets in elementary school. But you can get that. Right? Now, do we want that to become a part of a high stakes algorithmic accountability system? Probably not. But we don't have to have a high stakes algorithmic accountability system. This can be information for human beings that they can use to deliberate over and use human judgment around. So that's a second source of data. A third source of data would be teacher perception surveys, which we use. So ask teachers if they feel supported by leaders in their school. Ask them about the professional climate in their schools. We've looked at the data from our teacher perception surveys, and it turns out there is a lot of variance. We don't just see teachers all saying, I hate my principal, or all saying my colleagues are fantastic. There's a lot of variance there. And the things that we include that are assessed via a teacher perception survey can be assessed by people who are reflecting on their own experience, and when they are provided confidentiality and when the results are aggregated at the school level. And then finally, a student perception survey. And it turns out that people who spend 180 days inside schools, even if they're under the age of 18, know a lot about their own experiences, especially around questions of whether they feel safe, whether they have strong relationships with their peers, if they have strong relationships with the adults in the building, if they feel like the things they're learning reflect their cultural identities. And so again, aggregated at the level of the school, never broken down to a level where we would say, you know, this is a pretty small subgroup. And if even a small group of kids got together and started saying, you know, we're all gonna give a low rating to our school for how safe we feel, that they would be able to measurably impact that measure. But again, you know, there are folks who would say, well, this is a soft measure, right? This is too soft to be included in the accountability system. And I would say maybe if you are going to have a high stakes algorithmic form of accountability, but if you are going to have something that is more rooted in human judgment and that is not going to render automatic accountability, then I think it absolutely is critical to hear from students and from faculty who spend, again, 180 days inside a school and know it really well.
Just add a little bit to that. Yeah, I agree. And I think there are other both sort of subjective and objective ways of doing it. And there are other data like teacher turnover. We talked about how that's a problem, and that probably indicates whether there's a right environment there. I actually do think school attendance can be useful. You want to drive the right kinds of solutions to that. But then also things like capstones. I mean, you can get direct evidence. So you talked about being able to walk into a school. You've probably seen like the civics projects that they present here, give a really good picture of what's going on in that school. And a capstone project, if every senior is doing them, or if most are, the community can directly get access to that. And you might be able to think of ways for teachers to work together across schools to sort of compare that. So I think there are a lot of different kinds of things, or also just things that we know are good that are easy to measure. Is there a librarian in school? Are there enough paraprofessionals and other ESPs to support students with special needs or other students? And those are things that are very measurable and very comparable that are really meaningful. And again, no one is going to be perfect. I think that's the key point. But if you have enough of them and ones that paint a really vivid picture, and I think really importantly, encourage the things that you want to encourage, so that if the result of this is people are going to focus on doing well on that, that should be a good thing. So like if it's a capstone project and what students have to learn is to really bring together their knowledge, master a subject, go deep into a topic, learn how to communicate about it effectively, and they're spending all their time doing that, that's probably a good thing, right? So and I think thinking that way, that it's not just what are we measuring, what do you learn about the measure, but how does that influence what happens in classrooms?
And I'll just add that all 5 of the measures that Noah just speculated about including, we include in MCIA. And one thing I didn't mention is that we try to have these indicators speak to each other, right? So it's not just multiple measures, it's multiple ways of trying to get at the same construct. So Noah mentioned student attendance. Student attendance, pair it with things like student perception survey scales around safety, belonging, valuing learning, peer perception surveys about their impressions of their students. These things can then begin to produce a 3-dimensional portrait where you say, well, maybe it's just this one piece and It could be a fluke in the student survey, but you see, wow, it corresponds with what we're seeing from teachers, and our attendance is down this year, and we have more behavioral incidents at the school. And you begin to see, okay, there's a pattern. Right? These things are triangulating with each other.
Perspectives. I'm particularly interested in all of those examples from other parts of the country. Is there at the state level, is there anything?
Yeah, so I think if I may ask you a question, are you interested in innovative assessment approaches, innovative accountability? Where should I focus my time? So, and actually, I have been personally involved in innovative assessment design in Louisiana and their curriculum aligned assessment program that operated under a federal waiver. I've been involved in Montana in their 3-year pilot for a number of years. I've supported Delaware and a number of other states. I would not recommend those approaches here for Massachusetts. I think the K-12 Graduate Council has set you on a course around capstones, around EOCs. I would focus on what innovation needs to take place within those programs, and I'm happy to talk about it as link. So I'll touch on that in a second. What I wanted to talk about is innovation and accountability, right? So under federal law, to receive Title I funds, there has to be a system that has specific things that happen. The bottom 5% of schools need to be identified. They need to be provided funds. Your system is built on top of that. You have a state system that built on top of it. And there's a number of states that are considering alternatives. Personally, I've just worked in New Hampshire, and they've developed a system where they have identification under their state system happening every 2 years based on performance indicators. And every 3 years, states go through a peer review process. This is planned, this is proposed, we'll see if it plays out. And the idea is that 20% of the schools will have essentially a peer review of leaders selected from other schools. And that will be solely formative, right? And it will involve a number of these other indicators, and I can list some of them, drawn from a national category support that list a number of equity indicators. So the indicators, some of them that the committee have landed on is access to credentialed teachers, access to high quality instructional materials, access to high quality instruction, access to high quality academic support, counseling, etc. Access to grade 1, 2, early literacy, numeracy screening and support. Right? These are things we know really matter. And they've said, well, we think there needs to be a formative process within our evaluation system where people come together from schools, school leadership, to weigh in and provide feedback. That's an example of
That basically school accreditation.
that they are trying to instantiate school accreditation within their state accountability model, right? So yes.
But how is that accountability? That's just measuring the inputs.
So the accountability is baked into the indicators themselves. So they have the peer review process, and then there's going to be a line drawn based on the more performance-based indicators. So that they're trying to couple an identification based on academic performance and a number of other things with this peer review process as a way in which to support ongoing continuous improvement in a way that's not disjointed. So that's one example of innovative accountability that I'm aware of. And I think I want to just mention that response burden and collection burden is real. So for example, in New Hampshire, it is very hard to get high quality data on career and college readiness. Like gathering those indicators, for example, just getting ASVAB from the military is a really difficult process. And so having support for whatever indicators you think are valuable to collect is important. Because usually it's maybe the front office that just puts stuff in a spreadsheet, right? So whenever we think about collecting information, I think then the question is, how is it going to play out? Is there adequate training? And can then we trust that information? So that was a little bit on the innovative assessment side. I don't want to go too much into this, right? The New Hampshire PACE project, which performance assessment, was discontinued by the department, and now a number of districts have taken up. It's called PLACE. But that was an attempt to use solely performance assessment in the state summative system. Currently, Montana has gone in a different route. They now have subdivided their assessment essentially into a whole bunch of testlets that are given across the year and rolled up. They're the only state to do so for the general assessment. There's mixed opinions on it. The field has had a lot of critiques. students actually appreciate the experience a little bit more. Some other states are potentially moving in that direction. North Carolina, in a different vein, has a couple kind of optional interims to their state summative to try to provide and promote data-driven decision-making leading into their summative. And there's a few other states that are kind of tinkering with their assessment designs. And I think what I would emphasize there is context really matters. When you start to have assessment reach into instructional practice more directly, suddenly all of the implementation concerns that we have around other academic interventions, right, reading intervention, come into play. So the moment the state test or another test comes into the classroom more directly, there's a whole bunch of other considerations that really need to be deeply attended to, not the least of which is professional learning, right, and supporting educators in using these tools. So I'm happy to dig into any of those examples. I don't know where I'm at in time.
Sorry, if I heard you when you said that what Montana's done is just moved away from one standardized test at the end of the year.
Yeah, so they've gone to,
standardized tests, or
yeah.
is that the difference?
Yeah, so
But they're still statewide standardized tests?
yes, in mathematics, students take 12 smaller tests throughout the year.
Okay. So but so it's still based on standardized test scores, but it's just.
Yeah, so
We have
they
administrative.
take little 12-item tests throughout the year within 3 windows that are then aggregated to produce a summative score. It's most extreme example of that type of model of thinking, and there's field has had.
Yes, is there any other state that is trying to do like what MCIA is trying to do, where really looking at a rich, you know, Jack, you talked about what 36 potential indicators, again, collected in different ways. Is anyone else trying experimenting with that, looking at that beyond? Is MCIA unique in the entire nation, I guess, is what I'm getting at?
Oh, were you trying to respond to that? I'm happy to also respond to this.
Actually, you could just respond to that.
Sure. Yeah, the point a moment ago that we have built our accountability system on top of what is required by federal law is an important point, because there are a number of other states that either operate 2 accountability systems or that operate a kind of formal state accountability system with the recognition that districts are going to have more meaningful kinds of local accountability systems. And so MCIA is hardly alone in this regard. It is just that you mostly do not see radical innovation at the state level in states where there is a kind of unitary accountability system because of the pretty narrow box that ESSA has established. The language is something like, you know, the preponderance of the total accountability determination. Other folks may know the language more precisely than I do. Needs to be a result of standardized test scores with proficiency. I believe the guidance is outweighing growth.
Okay.
And
Let's take as a given that we're
Yep.
kind of stuck with that right now.
Right.
It's a federal law. Okay, so we have to have.
But you can have
Can I
it.
push back?
You can have a separate, so let me just finish this point. You can have it in a separate.
Well, that's what I want to get at,
system.
but
Yes. And
how does that separate system? What makes it
that could be what you actually meaningfully do in the state where
is
you,
anyone doing that?
yes,
Actually taking that alternative.
yes,
Is more the district
Yes.
level and actually making that the meaningful assessment and accountability such that that is what teachers, students, parents, community members actually care about. And the official system is like, yeah, we gotta do that,
yep,
but we're not paying attention.
yep. I know no one wants to give.
Now, like 2 states that I think might be good examples. I'm sure people here know more about both. In California. And one key thing is this question of whether you try to roll everything up into one number so you can rank it, which is what Massachusetts does, or do you do a dashboard where you have a lot of different measures? And California takes the dashboard approach, and it both has state level issues and it has local issues. And they don't pay much attention. My understanding is the federal piece of it is not a significant part of their overall system, that they really do.
Is it a dashboard for every school?
I think every school and district has its own dashboard, and some of the measures are common across them and some are individual to them. And they do have things like school facilities, you know, these schools have good facilities, parent and family engagement, measures of that, school climate, but then a lot of the other kind of measures that we talked about. The other is Kentucky, where they also have a very local centered system. Just read what they say about their system on their website. This model shifts away from labeling and compliance and toward a system built on local innovation shared ownership, and vibrant learning experiences to reflect what Kentuckians have asked for, a model that celebrates what matters, builds trust, and helps every learner grow in meaningful ways. So there, they really do empower local districts and sort of encourage and require them to talk to community members, talk to parents, talk to educators, talk to students. They have sort of intermediaries or experts on these topics that the universities play a role and really do help localities to sort of figure out, what is it that we want to measure? How are we going to measure it most effectively? And then how are we going to make sure that we are being accountable to our local community and that people are seeing what's happening. I do think there's like this trade-off between, do you start by saying, what do we really care about? And at the state level, maybe that's the vision of a graduate now, but also locally really asking that question and engaging people, and then try to figure out how to measure it, which is not easy. These are hard things to measure. Or do you say, what's most important is that we find things that are easy to measure and easy to compare across districts and go with those things, even if they're not what we actually think is important. And the danger that I think we fall into often in Massachusetts is we say what's most important is being able to compare, rank, and sort. So we have to use those things that are easiest to measure rather than those things that measure what we really care about. And that's really dangerous because it can drive education away from the directions that we want to be going in.
So appreciate those examples of Kentucky and California. It sounds like Kentucky may be the furthest along, and essentially the NCIA model taking it statewide. I'm curious if there's what the result has been. Is there any evidence that has led to improved learning and student performance and outcomes? In Kentucky?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think they're relatively early in the process. Also, it's an interesting question about how you measure that. How do we compare? So, yeah, I think that it'd be a fascinating question to talk to folks in Kentucky about how they think it's working, whether it's giving them data.
Yes.
But there's also part two, which is once we have an accountability system and figure out the measurements, and then we identify the schools or the districts that need support, then what supports are actually available and for how long. And so, I mean, Kentucky could have a really great system or assessment system, but if they don't actually have the funds to then provide the supports and sustain it, then there's a whole second piece that's missing to it. And I think that's the issue here in Massachusetts too, is, honestly, if being a level 4 or 5 district actually meant that it wasn't punitive, but you actually got support and like things like community schools, and that you were promised that you would not lose your literacy coach or your acceleration cadence, I think people would be raising their hands and being like, count us as a 4 or 5 district, right? But that's just not what's happened. And so I don't think we can talk about a system without also talking about realistically what the resources and supports are. And even with Academy Holland, which I mentioned earlier, they're coming out of receivership, but they're worried actually that they're going to lose some of the things that they've gotten that actually have been successful and helpful in helping their students achieve more. And so, and that we've seen that time and time again, that, schools are identified, they get extra resources and supports, they do better, and then they come out of whatever special designation they have, and then they lose those supports, and then they go back to square one. And so ultimately, we have to think about, well, what are the basic things, like I was saying earlier, that every school should have? Where are the resources, and how do we sustain them, to your point too? So it's
hard to separate the conversation.
Yeah, if we're trying to actually improve
funding.
Yeah.
And it almost goes beyond school resources. So if we are talking about a lot of these things correlating with poverty, they talk about a sort of broader accountability system, and poverty is caused ultimately by state policies. So are there things the state should be doing to make sure that people have access to housing so they're not homeless, or access to good nutrition, access to healthcare, access to all of the things that, make it challenging for kids to come to school ready to learn? And I think, as Jessica said, community schools is one path there that I think is really promising. If we can create a system that encourages schools to be able to provide healthcare supports, nutrition supports, mental health supports, dental supports, after-school programs, and also that kind of community where sort of the kinds of accountability we're talking about can come really naturally, because there's much more parental engagement in the schools, community engagement in the school. So I think I actually do think that the state should be doing a lot outside of schools to make sure that we attack poverty, and also make sure people have got jobs with decent wages. But then things like, I think community schools is a really promising policy. If we know that the schools that are facing the most challenges are simply the schools in the lowest income districts, let's figure out ways to address both school quality, the simple school quality there, and also meeting all the other needs of young people there. And I think community schools are a great way to do that.
And I do think, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Senator DiDomenico, I think, is not here with us anymore, but I think the Enough Act is trying to get at that too, of addressing the poverty and those other factors. And so if we're going to talk about like legislation that actually can move the needle.
Yeah, we'll move to that actually.
Great. Yeah.
I would just, I mean, I don't want to lose sight of that point. Like the statistic I was like, what percent of waking hours do kids spend in school? Right. And it's like 20%. Right. And so like, let's remember all the support for things outside of education while doing the best we can to support teachers in education. So don't lose sight of that. But what I do want to say, like, let's be cautious about something. So I think the California dashboard, from everything I've read, kind of stinks. This is like a direct quote from Morgan Polikoff, who co-authored the test-based accountability chapter I mentioned before. The quality of the metrics that go into the dashboard stink. Like, again, back to my point, there have to be high quality metrics. I'm not saying 0.9 reliability, don't get me wrong. It has to be like the right measures, like even if it's 0.7, I'll take that. But the quality of the metrics that go into the dashboard stink, and there's no clear user, right? And if you think about MCIA, you have a clear user in mind. Who's using the scores, the data, for what purpose is the question, and there's no clear end user in mind for these, indicators systems that you have in California. So it's sort of a cautionary tale that just because you create indicators, and again, to double click on the 2019 National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine report on monitoring equity indicators. Unfortunately, we can't say equity anymore, so just say monitoring educational opportunity, equality of opportunity indicators. But that report is really good, and I don't want to lose sight of the fact that in addition to listing a lot of the indicators that are sort of overlapping with what Jack measures in MCIEA, they also propose a governance system at the end. They model it after the National Assessment Governing Board that I was on, the Dallas on, Marty West, a bunch of other people have been on, that sort of creates this entity that says which measures does the state, in this case, and in that case it'd be the nation, but which measures does the state care about? Because as much as Jackson work, you need sort of state buy-in about the measures that matter and the quality of those measures. And so as we think about potential legislation or structures that can improve the system in the future, if there's, I don't know if it would be the state board or a separate entity that could sort of weigh in on like which indicators do we believe every district and school, again, the data and much of the data is already there, but how do we report it? How do we create standards for it, both quality standards and performance level standards for it? And how do we get state buy-in so it isn't just Jack or isn't just, some one-off group saying, here's what I think I care about. There should be some structure for the state to weigh in on the indicators that matter, the multiple measures that matter beyond test scores.
Well, I think the idea behind MCIA, and real shout out to Senator Jalen for championing MCIA in the legislature for a number of years now, was to kind of pilot out, right, the number of opt-in districts, how to figure out what these indicators are, how to measure them, how to get buy-in from the community. So I guess to the point I was making, if we wanted to scale that to statewide, what has stopped us from moving in that direction? Because it seems like CIA has kind of had the same. It's at 7 or 9 districts. It hasn't been able to sort of grow beyond that. Certainly, is far from sort of something that we would scale statewide. So, what do you think are what have been the barriers?
Sure. Yeah, we actually now work with 36 districts. So the number of governing districts has remained small because there's a high level of burden to be a governing district. Your teachers union, your central office, your school committee all need to be bought in on this. You need to be members of our various steering committees, whereas lots of other districts say, hey, we really like the school quality measures dashboard. We want to do this, and we'll work with them on that. And we give it away for free, and we support them for free thanks to our support from the state legislature, where they say, hey,
36 districts are now using the school quality dashboard?
Either using our school quality measures tools or doing performance assessment work with us. which has teed them up for the new capstone or portfolio component of the graduation requirement, at least as proposed.
Is DESE doing anything to encourage districts to avail themselves?
No, and quite the opposite. And so to answer your question now about what the stumbling block is, the stumbling block has been that we have had, I think it's fair to say, no cooperation from the department across our decade of existence, and where I won't tell tales out of school, but I will say that there are folks who have been inside the department at various points. I won't talk about whether or not they are there, who have been very threatened by the very idea of a multiple measure system, a system in which we perhaps drive more authority and decision-making power to the level of community members who distrust community members, who do not like the idea of a system that might not identify our most economically disadvantaged communities as bad schools. So there are folks inside the department who continue to view MCIA as a threat, despite the fact that we have had a spot on our governing board, a non-voting member of the governing board for DESE, as long as we have been in existence.
And they have not filled.
Sometimes somebody from DESE attends, sometimes not. And then the assessment accountability system, as it continues to exist, is the fundamental barrier, because ultimately what we're asking districts to do is run two kinds of assessment and accountability systems simultaneously. One that's official and for which they are truly held accountable by the state, and the other which is an experiment. And the fact that we have had districts who have stuck with us for 10 years or who keep joining on, I think is a testament to the quality of what they feel they're getting here, because it means that the superintendent, the assistant superintendent, various principals, the teachers union president, the educators who are most bought in are all doing additional work, and they're all trying to meet the requirements of the existing state assessment accountability system. And at the same time, they're paying attention. So, there's a principal in Milford, Massachusetts, for instance, who is absolutely obsessed with the school quality measures dashboard, and who can talk out of one side of her desk about how important it is for her to see, do her students feel safe? Do they feel a sense of belonging? Do they value school? Are they engaged in class? And who can come over to this side of her desk and say, by the way, our proficiency scores are down this year, and I am going to need to spend tremendous time on this. And that means that even though I care about all of this stuff, it can't be a priority for me this year. And so,
Very challenging.
yes.
So let's say hypothetically, the attitude at DESE changed tomorrow.
Yeah.
And they are now fans of MCIA.
Yeah.
They love the work that's going on. They want to see it scaled across the state.
Yeah.
So how do we avoid having to have two separate systems? Because aren't we still subject to the federal law?
Yep.
And so Kentucky, how do they manage this? But how would we avoid having the official system that we have to report, and, because the federal law requires that, and the real system that is authentic, customs driven down the community?
Others may want to weigh in on this, but there is a world that you can envision in which the official state dashboard includes lots of the kinds of indicators that we include on our dashboard, in which there is no rating and ranking of schools, where you cannot produce a rank ordered list of schools by accountability percentile top to bottom, but where you could see who's really doing great in terms of the access to the arts that students have, who's knocking it out of the park in terms of SGP, where you could look at things like that. And then meanwhile, DESE could be reporting to the federal government on the lowest 5% of performers as identified by MCAS, and not making that a part of the system that it uses for for support of schools and districts here in the
So
Commonwealth.
you just report that to the federal government and not necessarily do anything else with that data, not even make that data.
I think these two want to weigh in.
Would you like to? Go ahead. Right, so the law's pretty agnostic, right? ESSA requires that students be assessed annually on a number of subjects and that the assessment provides 3 classifications, right? So 3 levels of reporting. Sometimes that would be, above proficient, proficient up.
With schools or students?
For students, and then that's aggregated.
They've got to give MCAS.
Yeah, well, they have to give something.
Yep, sorry.
Right.
Yes.
It doesn't have to be, and it could be a very short test. It just has to produce 3 levels of
Yep.
reliability.
Yep.
Then there's a level of governance underneath it that requires a lot that you could argue through. So we're like, that's the law. And then requires annual reporting so that it will have to happen. Otherwise, Title I funds would be jeopardized, right? In a number of grant programs. So I think one of the distinctions to draw in into separate concerns, right, is that has to happen in some way, shape, or form. What should be the assessment vehicle that happens, right? The MCAS, another test, right? There are options there. Then I think subsequently, right, once you satisfy the kind of the federal requirements, you can make a system as big or as small as you want. For example, Colorado has a school performance framework. That's not their federal system, that's their state system. And that carries much of the emphasis and concern that's focused on school quality, right? And so I think then the question is, for the state system, is it coupled or decoupled from the federal? And what do you want to do with it ultimately? And I think the only corollary I would add here is, for things that are reported, I think it's incredibly important to think about what guidance is provided around that, why it could be meaningful, and ultimately why people on the ground think it's worth collecting statewide, which is somewhat of a hard sell, right? Because things are important to some districts given their own strategic plans. Things are not important in other districts. We found that in New Hampshire, right? Because we couldn't get all of the districts to sign on to performance assessment. We got a core that were really interested, and they've continued to do the work. So I think the real question is, for a state system, you can report any variety of things, right? You can build structures that you want. The question is what's going to be sustainable long-term and what's going to lead into the school improvement practices. And I think challengingly, what can last on the order of organizational change? Organizational change takes 4, 5, 10, 15 years to really change culture. So what does that state system should look like over that time frame and is sustainable and implementable?
Well, I think that's a good segue, and I've covered a lot of ground so far, to really appreciate this fascinating discussion. And again, Senator Jalen or anyone else who's still with us, remotely, feel free to jump in. But let's move to our kind of final area that we wanted to cover, which is basically recommendations from our experts for actions or initiatives, next steps effectively in this area that you would like to see either from DESE and or from the state legislature going forward. So let's hear your thoughts on that. Yeah.
Hi, and apologies, I thought this ended at 3, not 4.
So do you have to leave right now?
Yes, but can I just share real quick and then
Go right ahead. If you have to leave, go right ahead. I'm sure you have thoughts on what you'd like to see happen.
Sure. So a few things. One, I do think there's
Let me interrupt you. Anything you want to share with us in writing, to follow up to this, we would welcome. So please feel free to do so. We'll get out.
So with the grad council doing the work that it's doing and the new grad requirements that are happening, I would hope that we could actually use that as an opportunity to do some of the things that we know works that we've discussed today. I don't know if and again, I'm saying this out loud, but I don't know if I agree with myself yet. But if there was a world in which end of course assessments are shorter assessments and don't take as much time as NCAS, but then counts for fulfilling the federal requirement, but is not punitive and is not used to deny anyone a diploma, maybe there's an opportunity there. Having mass core capstones and portfolios actually be done, I think, in a way that builds upon some of the work that MCIA has already been doing. Maybe the end of course assessments are actually from the bank of MCIA assessments. I don't know how that would work, but I just think there's opportunities here to actually implement the things that we've been talking about. And I do think that there's been some turnover in DESE, at least in DESE's leadership and at the EOE, that there is an opportunity hopefully to close the gap between the resistance we've seen historically and the potential to actually have full support from DESE and EOE for MCIA's work, but whether it's the performance tasks or the school quality measures. And then I also wonder about, no one's talked about a waiver, but like, I don't know, it doesn't seem to me like Department of Education is very helpful right now, so maybe now is a good time for a waiver for us to actually try new things that normally we would not maybe be able to do so easily and use their lack of oversight as an opportunity.
Do you want a reaction to that?
Oh, yeah.
I think I haven't read beyond the headline. They recently, as I understand it, agreed to portions of Indiana's waiver requests and have signaled an openness to working with states flexibly. I think there is actually an opportunity for the high school work to look at what accountability could look like writ large instead of, ACT or SAT or any one course, to think more comprehensively. And I think that would be attractive to the current leadership of the U.S. Department of Education.
And just specifically, the Indiana waiver said, I'm quoting from it, in the waiver, will remove the requirement that academic indicators receive much greater weight in the aggregate than school quality or student success indicators. Sorry. Remove the requirement that academic indicators receive much greater weight in the aggregate than school quality or student success indicators. So it was that's what they're waiving.
Federal requirement in ESSA is being.
So currently there's a requirement that those academic indicators.
To that, assignment to the US.
May I build on that? Because to our earlier discussion, Indiana had been operating two systems. They had been operating a system to be in compliance with ESSA, and they had been operating an Indiana system that they thought was a better assessment and accountability system. And so it was a so-called EdFlex waiver. So this has been baked into ESSA for years, but had been interpreted much more strictly previously. And so inasmuch as we may trust the present administration or take them at their word that they want to return responsibility to the states, it does appear that in the case of Indiana, they are returning assessment and accountability responsibility to that state and allowing it to operate a unitary assessment and accountability system that places it no longer in formal compliance with ESSA via a waiver and is now a system that previously had been a not in compliance state-only system.
So the point is, there's opportunity, I think, there with the waivers, right? And then the other thing, though, is the Thrive Act. So we filed the Thrive Act last year, and we do think that would actually help start moving the needle towards being able to try these different alternative accountability systems and measures. Because although the current administration, I think, the last few years has chosen not to put schools under receivership or, take away collective bargaining rights and things like that have been extremely harmful and disruptive to our schools, the law is still there. And so if we have different administration, we could go back to those really bad times. And so there is immediate need to change the law so that we don't have to be handcuffed essentially to what currently exists in the current law. And so I really do hope that the Thrive Act is a step. And then there's obviously a lot of other pieces that need to be put into place as well. But again, making lemons out of lemonade, this might be an opportunity with the current state of the federal government, Department of Education. So, yeah.
If you do have to leave,
I'm so sorry.
No, absolutely. We really appreciate your participation today. Jessica Tang, President of the Massachusetts AFT. So thank you very much. And again, look forward to continuing the conversation with you and everybody else.
And this has been really helpful and productive, so I appreciate being here.
Follow up with
So
us,
thank you.
Okay, thank you, Senator. We won't be going that much longer, I think it will just be.
Yep,
It is online, so you can certainly continue, that was very perfect.
Dial-in on Zoom.
Being here today.
As you're walking out here.
Sitting in here, as I'm
Oh,
sure
okay.
you all know, it has been really oftentimes the leading voice champion in the legislature, raising these kinds of questions and we help to. Yeah, anything more, it's both about hard work and
things.
well, what we're hoping today again is to elevate this topic and so that others, will pick up the mantle here. And so Gail and I are along in the legislature and many of you will continue to push for this to be, and I agree there's both in terms of where we are with the United States Department of Education, there's an opening to take action. And I also think because, as I said in my opening remarks, that we're looking at what our new high school graduation requirement will be. Again, that opens the door very much, I think, having this as a parallel conversation. So really love to see that be the case.
And can I just thank the both of you too? I think it is a huge loss for all of us in the state of Massachusetts and in public education that we're losing the two of you who have been incredible champions. So I just want to appreciate you both. Thank you.
Thank you. So with that, further thoughts before we wrap up that you'd like to share in terms of what you'd like to see as next steps from the state legislature or from the Department of Education or other individual school districts or others actions you'd like to see?
I'll just.
What do you think policymakers could do to make that happen?
I'll just add one thing, because I had planned to bring up the current attitude at the US Department of Education. And I think related to that would be the possibility for establishing a pilot program or a series of pilot programs that would enable districts or consortia of districts to try out new approaches to assessment and accountability. So you asked earlier what our biggest hurdle has been, and it has been that we have not had a clear runway to do our work. We have always been running with obstacles in our way, and I would say a headwind, but you actually want a headwind as you're trying to take off in an airplane, I believe. So I won't use that metaphor, but at the same time, I don't believe that MCIEA's approach is the only way to do that. In fact, I will say that, to the point of, well, what if we did want to continue to have a system that looks a lot like the current system, but just not as bad? What would be the additional measures that might have the kind of validity and reliability that would allow them to stand right alongside chronic absenteeism and high school graduation rates and CAS scores? And some of our research that has come out of MCIEA has shown that actually, if you just included our student perception surveys, now, of course, like Dan Koretz has been invoked a couple times here, and as soon as you begin using them for anything with stakes associated with it, the picture may change. But what we did in an experiment was we looked at what would the accountability determination have been if we kept the existing Massachusetts accountability formula in place and added in the student perception survey that we use. And we just aggregated it all together, despite the fact that it's made up of about 15 different scales measuring a bunch of different constructs. And what we found is that overall accountability determinations would correlate less strongly with income, with race, with the number of English language learners in the district, and with the number of students with disabilities in the district. So right away, you would reduce some of the correlation between accountability determinations and student demography. Now, that's not my dream. That's not what I think the most just version of the world is. But maybe there is a consortia of districts that wants to just tinker with the system. And I think it would be great if we had some evidence of what that tinkering looks like here in Massachusetts, and some evidence of what something really revolutionary and different looked like. And let's do these experiments in Massachusetts. Let's have empirical evidence where we can say, well, what was the impact? What was the impact on student learning? What was the impact on, students 4 years after high school graduation, on employment, on degree attainment, on a variety of other things we could measure? What was the impact on the community's attachment to their local schools, or the feeling that their schools are responsive to local concerns? So my big recommendation would be, let's get that evidence by trying a few different things, and trying them in earnest, and trying them without all of the obstacles in the way, because I think that we have the political opportunity to do it.
Can I just, I want to appreciate the pitch. I don't think that reducing correlations with sociodemographic variables is dispositive, right? Like, and so this is the reason why civil rights groups are pushing back against Indiana, and something like you just said, is that if you use these measures for resource allocation, positive resource allocation, what you've just said is you're going to have fewer resources for lower performing students who might need them most. So if we think of accountability as pure shaming, then absolutely that's what we want to see. But if we think about it as a positive resource allocation and support, then we do want to continue giving them. But now, to go back to your point, we already know who needs support. Why don't we give it to them? All I'm saying is that this 2 by 2, where I was saying there's proficiency and there's growth. The reason why people are clinging to proficiency, and the reason why civil rights groups are arguing against Indiana's new waiver, is because that could potentially reduce positive resource allocation to those who need it most. So don't do that, right?
But only if there is positive resource allocation.
There you go. So the question, to go back to my point, the question is ultimately what you do with these measures. And right now we have this dangerous coupling of shame and resource allocation. And what I'm saying is we know where to allocate the resource, and we have to diminish the shame and the stigmatization. And proficiency and growth can help to disentangle that, as well as multiple measures in the quality indicator system. So maybe if I sum up, do you want to follow up on this?
That is very, how do we separate out who needs resources, and how we allocate those versus how do we measure quality and doesn't stick to us.
And that's the proficiency and growth distinction that I think we can follow up on.
One quick thought on that, and then please finish. I want to hear closing comments. It sort of goes back to this sort of theme of austerity versus plenty. I mean, we are a really rich state, and we somehow have this vision that we can only provide necessary resources to some small group of districts,
right,
and they first have to prove that they're failing. Resources.
So silly.
It serves backwards. Yes, and I get why some civil rights groups push back, because the frame that we're in says, unless we have these measures where some small group of districts can prove they're failing, nobody's going to get the resources they need. It's just a crazy world to be in, particularly in Massachusetts, where we often say, if you're a nation, we're the 5th wealthiest nation in the world. We could provide the resources that every district needs and not have to go through that, as you said, that shaming process.
This is where it goes back to sort of engagement and communication. As I was trying, I mean, again, what I was trying to lead with is that, again, why does testing continue to exist? It's because these numbers are leveraged. They are convincing. They are powerful. But there's this double-edged sword that we haven't been able to dull one edge and sharpen the other, whatever the right metaphor is. So I resonate with that. So if I were to just close, I would just say, like, a few things. First, just to reiterate, like, whatever you do, if there does start to be these targets, you need to set them such that they are achievable and empirically grounded. Second, comparable high quality measures, right? Like, and again, I don't, one of my favorite quotes from Joan Herman is psychometricians need to lighten up about reliability. right? By high quality, I don't mean a reliability of 0.9 at the student level. We can be judicious about what we mean by high quality, but there has to be evidence of that. And I know you agree. And I want to say something about comparability because we've used the term standardized in a way that is, speaking of stigmatizing, right? And I wrote down all the things that we think of standardized to mean, right? 1, narrow, 2, stigmatizing, 3, punishing, 4, biased, 5, inflexible, 6, impenetrable, 7, externally mandated, right? And that's what standardized feels like. Now, to measurement people, standardized means comparable. That's all we're saying. We're just saying that this number can be fairly compared to this other number. And you can see that in that obsession with comparability, psychometricians have historically gone awry by privileging, by letting go of all these other issues where they really did let bias and narrowness and power dynamics creep in. But ultimately, let's go back to the reason why we wanted standardized measures to begin with, which is not to carve up people and sort and select, is because we have comparable numbers that are ultimately interpretable so that we can act to allocate resources accordingly. And the final thing that I wanted to mention is that I think there should be some kind of task force or study or group that really works to help students, teachers, and schools take a low score and be productive with it. Because I can tell you that you can switch out whatever tests you want to switch out, but low scores will still exist. Low school scores, low teacher scores, low student scores will still exist. That should not hurt anyone's feelings. Think about coaching, right? Like in sports. It's like, oh, I missed a free throw. Oh no, I'm never gonna, that's my second basketball analogy, right? Think of it like coaching. We should be able to take low scores and do something productive with them. There's a way in which, like, every time we talked about testing, it's as if we're going to create this test that no one will have low scores anymore, and everyone will be happy and find their single one true happy score. No teachers will have low scores, and therefore we'll do away with stigma. The low scores will still be there. We have to inoculate ourselves to the idea that they are more meaningful, more precise, more permanent than they are. We can do something about them. That's the whole point. Right. So I think whenever we talk about new assessment systems, multiple measure systems, don't succumb to the illusion that everyone will have high scores thereby and find their strengths, because we all have areas of improvement. We have to take low scores and be productive with them. And that's something we can inoculate our kids against, our teachers against, our school system against going forward. So it's not shame or stigma anymore, but a commitment to help improve, because that's what this whole thing was about to begin with. Right, is that it's not just about shaming and stigma. It's about knowing where you are so that you can improve.
You should talk to Liam Skinner, the superintendent in Lowell, who, to Andrew's point, tied their school improvement planning process, which they've now made a 3-year planning process, to correspond with your point about how long it actually takes to improve, tied that to their MCIEA data dashboard, which they modified to make it the Lowell, I forget what their acronym is. And so they have built this system where they work with the data in their particular way through their school improvement planning process.
That's very quickly on your last point. I think that's right. And I think that's something that teachers do every single day. I mean, they do all kinds of assessments. They use them to help kids get better at what they want. They're going to help kids get better at. MCAS is particularly bad at that because you get the results the next year and it's a different teacher.
I get it. Yeah. And yeah, there's no agency, there's no transparency, right? I get it. But again, we have to, and parents too, they get these reports, and they're like, oh, and they don't know what an SGP is, speaking of that other number. And then it's like, it's a 20, and they're like, oh no. But we need to work on that. That's something that we can't, we are going to see numbers for the rest, they're going to see numbers for the rest of their lives, and they need to take an improvement and growth mindset to it, not to oversimplify it in that way. But I don't think we should proceed with the fiction that any assessment system will magically eliminate low scores. We have to prepare for them. And to Jack's point, give people the agency and sense of ownership over the data so that they can do something about them.
May I make a couple points? We have time. I have 3, maybe 4, maybe 5, we'll see. So I think first and foremost, right, Massachusetts is at a moment of inflection change, right? And so one thing that I would caution is to avoid innovation fatigue or spreading policy will over too many aspects of work. And by that, I mean, so right, commonly in the news, right, the Mississippi Miracle, right, went quite well in terms of early literacy. How that happened, right, was sustained leadership over 10 years, investment in early literacy coaches, right, investment. Like they had a sustained focus over many, many years. And so I think with this upcoming changes potentially in the accountability system, right, emphasis on high school assessment, this is an opportunity to figure out what are the high leverage policy priorities for the next 5, 10, 15 years, and how can that be a driving force? Because otherwise, right, we see in other states and maybe in the state, right, policy ideas come and go. 4 or 5 years, you get this idea, that idea, this idea, that idea, and the needle moves, but it moves around in different directions and over different periods of time. So that would be one thing is, right, thinking about how to take all of this momentum and sustain it over time. The second would be for allowing for meaningful adjustment. And by that, I mean implementation. It really matters, right? I gave the example in New Hampshire where not knowing your funding year to year for school support was incredibly challenging to implement systemic reform. So it's finding those pressure points either through, state supported monitoring and formative evaluation or other mechanisms, and really addressing those as they emerge would be really powerful. And then I think to Jack's point, right, like I would actually say that the current theory of action, theory of change for the state system naively, right, is raise a red flag for the schools we think that really need support and give them support, right? And that is a change mechanism for improving schools that really need support. That is not a change mechanism for all schools in the state, right? So I think there's a question for, in Massachusetts at the state level, how much and for whom, right? Who is the accountability system meant to serve? We know that the federal system is meant to serve schools that ostensibly need support. So I think the question is, for the upcoming systems, who, right, is going to be served and what is the theory of action there? Yeah, I think that's 3 points. So.
Okay. Very good. You're good.
A couple of comments to close. I'll be very brief. I guess there are two big problems with our current system. It measures the wrong things and it does the wrong things with what it measures. So on the second piece, we've all talked about just not having a punitive system for what you do with districts that need support. As President Tang said, the Thrive Act would get rid of our current system of state takeovers. That's a simple step, sort of. And then that would create, I think, a cultural change saying we don't want to use punitive measures, we want to use supportive measures. The other piece is to say, take a step back and say, what is it we really want to accomplish? And then figure out ways to measure those things. And I don't think we're going to figure that out in the next 10 minutes. I think that's actually a long-term process of really engaging deeply in communities with parents, with educators, with community groups, to develop that first real step of where is it we want to get to. And then we can design assessment systems and accountability systems that sort of encourage that. So I just say, a next step would be a much broader public process of trying to resolve those questions.
Very good. All right. Well, I'm very grateful to all of you for joining us today and for sharing your insights and your research and your wisdom and with other members of the committee. Thank you to my staff for their work organizing the briefing today. We have I believe we're recorded, so this is all recorded. We will be sharing it with others so that this will be further disseminated. Again, any further information, research, anything else that pertains to this topic area that you want to share, please go ahead and do so. You can also share it with the other education committee members. And my hope is that we've really stimulated conversation on this very important, complicated topic area, and that this needs to continue. I will do everything I can in my remaining time in the state senate to continue to push this conversation forward and have it on the agenda. And I'm confident that there will be other legislators who will hopefully pick up the mantle next session. Next legislative session, you're undoubtedly one of the top priority issues will be, what will be the new statewide high school graduation requirement? And that will sure be hotly debated. And so trying to bring this conversation into that as well, and thinking about it as an opportunity to look at ways that we can bring some of this thinking to a broader scale in Massachusetts, I think would be very exciting. So I'll certainly continue to do my part to push that forward, but all of you, of course, feel empowered to do so through your work, through your relationships, with other stakeholders, with policymakers. And I look forward to that dialogue continuing. Thank you very much, everyone.
You.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everybody online. Have stamina to that. Appreciate it.
Preparing myself for the heat wave outside.